Formula One, a sport like no other. This isn't just about pushing the limits of human ability. It's about bending physics and chemistry to mankind's will. Exploration and experimentation, the twin pillars of human progress, have driven us from the first flicker of fire to the monumental moon landing. It's this unquenchable thirst for discovery and the urge to push boundaries that has carved our path through history. This quest led us to conquer oceans, delve deep into the earth, spark the Industrial Revolution, and ultimately give birth to the combustion engine. The dawn of the combustion engine brought about new possibilities. The horseless carriage, as cars were first known, was slower than walking at first. Just a toy for rich men with more money than sense. In England, from 1865 to 1896, you had to have someone walk in front of you waving a red flag to warn horse riders and people walking that you were coming. For years, they were impractical, unreliable, and far more expensive than a horse and carriage, but that wouldn't last for long. Since the very first motor cars hit the streets of Europe, there was a battle across the continent to go faster and further. Steam, hydrogen, coal, and gasoline were trialed to varying success, and famous names like Benz and Daimler appeared for the first time, unaware of just how much of an impact they would have on the future of the human race at that time. In America, Henry Ford was fighting a patented four-wheeled, self-propelled car that George B. Selden designed. Selden licensed his patent to most major American automakers, collecting a fee on each car they produced, until Ford got the patent overturned. In this era of exploration and experimentation, men in every country were claiming they had made the fastest or the most reliable car. Where there are egos, there will be competition, and it wasn't long until motor racing started to grow. The earliest recorded motor race occurred in the northwest of England at 4:30 AM on August 30th, 1867, between Ashton-under-Lyne and Old Trafford, Manchester, a distance of 8 miles. It was won by the car of Isaac Watt Bolton, beating a vehicle believed to be owned by a Mr. Schmidt. The details of who was involved are a little hazy, as the race broke the red flag laws mentioned earlier. On July 16, 1878, the first US motor race with a prize purse was run over a 200-mile course from Green Bay to Appleton, Oshkosh, Warpen, Watertown, Fort Atkinson, and Janesville, then turning north and ending in Madison. Only 2 vehicles actually competed, the Oshkosh and the Green Bay, named after the towns they originated from. The uptake for motor racing was slow, like the cars that were being driven. Self-driven vehicles were hated by the majority of the population for many years. Loud, noisy, dangerous, and quickly becoming too fast to be respectable, they were left to be rich boys' toys for many years. Nonetheless, after the construction of the first successful gasoline-fueled automobiles, motorsport began to thrive. On July 22, 1894, the Parisian magazine Le Petit Journal organized what is considered to be the world's first motoring competition, from Paris to Rouen. Created as a publicity stunt for the magazine, 102 competitors paid a 10 franc entrance fee. 69 cars started the 50-kilometer selection event, or qualifying as such things would come to be called, that would show which entrants would be allowed to start the main event. The race started from Port-de-Mello and went through the Bois de Boulogne. Count Jules Albert de Dion was first into Rouen after 6 hours and 48 minutes at an average speed of 19 kilometers an hour. He finished 3 minutes and 30 seconds ahead of Albert Lemaitre in a Peugeot. The official winners were Peugeot and Panhard, as cars were judged on their speed, handling, and safety characteristics. De Dion was disqualified as his steam car needed a stoker, which was forbidden. The technology behind motorcars started to improve at an exponential rate, and it wasn't long before racing moved off the roads and onto tracks. The driving force behind the movement of racing to circuits, as opposed to racing on ordinary roads from town to town, was the Paris to Madrid road race of 1903. During this race, a number of people, both drivers and pedestrians, including Renault co-founder Marcel Renault, were killed. The race was eventually stopped by French authorities at Bordeaux, and road-based events were banned. The first closed-circuit automobile race happened years before that though, on September 7, 1896, at the Narragansett Trotting Park in Cranston, Rhode Island, and was won by an electric car built by the Riker Electric Vehicle Company. That was just a repurposed riding area though. Motor racing deserved its own area. Aspendale Racecourse in Australia was the world's first purpose-built motor racing circuit, opened in January 1906. The pear-shaped track was close to a mile in length with slightly banked curves and a gravel surface of crushed cement. Once there were purpose-built tracks in place, the sky was the limit for motorcar performance, and those early innovators did everything they could to reach it. Grand Prix racing had already begun by the time road racing was banned. The first was run in 1901 around the streets of the city of Pau. That's right, the first ever Grand Prix was a street circuit. The name Grand Prix, or Big Prize in English, was actually the reward for the first place finisher Maurice Farman, who drove his Panhard 24 horsepower to victory. In 1904, motor racing started to become more organized. Many national motor clubs banded together to form the Association Internationale des Automobiles Clubs Reconnus, which would later become the FIA. While there was Grand Prix racing for many years though, the idea of an actual championship would take much longer to form. It wasn't until 1922 that serious discussions began, and then, in 1925, the first Grand Prix World Championship took place. It was for manufacturers only though, and the rules were far looser than any that Formula One would see. Manufacturers would simply create the fastest car they possibly could and race it against the fastest car of their competitors. The First and Second World Wars would delay the start of true formula racing until midway through the 20th century. The idea of a formula, or a strict set of rules, was nothing new to the sport at that time, but an international motorcar series that abided by a formula was. The initial framework for formula racing was actually put in place in the late 30s, but it wasn't until 1947 that the newly named FIA would announce the first Formula One championship, to begin in 1950. The 1950s marked the inception of what would become one of the most prestigious and thrilling motorsport championships in the world, Formula One. As the dust settled after the devastation of World War II, a new era of speed, skill, and technological innovation was dawning on the racing circuits. Sport was the world's escape from the terrors that Nazi Germany inflicted upon it. And in Formula One, the world had the most exciting sport imaginable. Those early drivers were like superheroes, putting their lives on the line every time they stepped in the car. Those early cars weren't built for driver safety. There were no halos or survival cells, there wasn't a requirement for fireproof clothing, and there weren't even seatbelts. Stepping into a Formula One car to race was like standing on the Grim Reaper's doorstep and asking him to try and catch you. Luckily for those early drivers, they had the fastest cars in the world. The inaugural season consisted of 7 races, each held on legendary circuits that would go on to shape the identity of the championship for decades to come. Silverstone, the iconic British racing circuit, hosted the first ever Formula One World Championship race on May 13, 1950. The Silverstone circuit, originally a World War II airfield, saw the thunderous roar of the engines as Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, and Maserati cars lined up on the grid. With 150,000 spectators at the track for race day, Silverstone set the tone for the series, with Giuseppe Farina claiming victory and etching his name in the history books as the first Formula One Grand Prix winner. Although he was noted for his driving style and intelligence, he had a petulant streak and disregard for his fellow competitors whilst on the racetrack, traits not dissimilar to the best Formula One drivers of the modern era as well. Like many of those early drivers, Farina wasn't a young man. He was 43 at that first Silverstone Grand Prix, but he was experienced. It was his bravery, or stupidity, that allowed him to push his Alfa Romeo to victory ahead of the likes of Juan Manuel Fangio and Alberto Ascari, 2 drivers that would be pivotal to the early years of F1. The season continued with circuits like Monaco, Spa-Francorchamps, Reims-Gouges, Bremgarten, Monza, and Pedralbes. Each track posed unique challenges, from the narrow streets of Monaco to the high-speed straights of Monza. Drivers had to master a diverse range of skills to conquer these circuits, testing not only their speed but also their precision and adaptability. That variability of circuit style became a cornerstone of Formula One. Cars couldn't just have a high top speed or turn quicker than any others, they had to be able to do both, and only in achieving the balance between those two things could you become a Formula One world champion? The 1950s saw the rise of iconic racing cars and brands that became synonymous with Formula One. Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, and Maserati were the dominant forces in the early years, each contributing to the allure of the sport. The Alfa Romeo 158 and later upgraded to the 159, both of which Farina and Fangio drove in that first season, was a formidable force on the track. Its 1.5-litre supercharged straight-8 engine produced an impressive 425 horsepower. The Italian masterpiece, also known as the Alfetta, carried Giuseppe Farina to victory in the inaugural season, securing the championship for Alfa Romeo. All told, the 158 and 159 would take 47 wins from the 57 Grand Prix it entered. Ferrari, with its iconic prancing horse emblem, entered the Formula One scene with the 375 F1. This V12-powered machine, driven by legends like Alberto Ascari and eventually Juan Manuel Fangio, showcased Ferrari's commitment to speed and performance. In their first season, a Ferrari would fail to win a race, but that wouldn't last for long. In 1951, they won their first race, and from then on, they would win in every season during the 1950s, bar the 1957 season, when Fangio moved from the Scuderia to Maserati. Speaking of Maserati, the Maserati 250F, with its sleek lines and powerful engine, became a symbol of timeless elegance. Piloted by the likes of Juan Manuel Fangio and Stirling Moss, the 250F played a crucial role in the championship battles of the 1950s. Its innovative design and exceptional handling made it a favourite among drivers and fans alike. The 1950s witnessed the rise of legendary figures who left an indelible mark on Formula One, shaping the sport's early narrative and captivating audiences around the world. At the time, they probably had no idea that the stories of their racing days would be passed down for generations to come. While drivers from across Europe and the Americas drove in Formula One races, those early seasons were filled with drivers from Great Britain, Italy, and Argentina. Of all the Argentines, though, the one that set the tone for exceptional South American drivers was Juan Manuel Fangio. The Argentine racing maestro made his Formula One debut in 1950 and quickly established himself as one of the greatest drivers of the era. Fangio's smooth and calculated driving style, combined with an uncanny ability to read races, earned him 5 world championships in the 1950s. Winning a title behind the wheel of an Alfa Romeo, a Ferrari, a Mercedes-Benz, and a Maserati, he's still the only driver to win a world championship for more than 2 teams. It was a feat that proved just how incredible a driver he was. He holds the highest winning percentage in Formula One at 46.15%, winning 24 of the 52 Formula One races he entered. Additionally, Fangio also holds the record for the highest pole percentage at 55.77%, achieving 29 pole positions from 52 entries. It was battles with fellows like Ascari and Moss, though, that would really become the stuff of racing folklore. Stirling Moss, the British racing prodigy, emerged as a fearless challenger to the established order. It wasn't until 1955 that Moss really appeared on the F1 scene. He was the first British driver to win the British Grand Prix, held at Aintree that year. Unfortunately for Moss, he came to Formula One at the same time as Fangio was in his prime. Despite narrowly missing out on a championship, Moss's talent and daring exploits made him a fan favourite, and his reputation, especially in British motorsport, is still strong to this day. His iconic victories at circuits like Monaco and Monza solidified his status as one of the era's most celebrated drivers. Alberto Ascari was an Italian racing icon of the time and secured back-to-back championships in 1952 and 1953, driving for Scuderia Ferrari. In those first years of Formula One, Alberto was the only driver who could really hold a flame to the incredible talents of Fangio. Ascari's dominance on the track, coupled with his charismatic personality, made him a beloved figure in the world of motorsport. Tragically, Ascari's life was cut short in a testing accident in 1955, leaving a void in the racing community. This was the risk in early Formula One, though. The drivers knew that when pushing these incredible machines to the limit, they were risking their lives. The evolution of safety technology would not come to Formula One for many years. Instead, the focus of those early seasons was on the technology of the cars. The freedom of the regulations and the post-war zeal for innovation and achievement meant that the technology being used innovated at an incredible rate as well. As engineers and designers pushed the boundaries of innovation, the cars evolved from the simple and raw machines of the post-war era to more sophisticated and specialized racing vehicles. It is important to frame this innovation with the war because it is the war that led to so much of this innovation. The requirements of the armies of the world evolved rapidly during World War II. An area that was particularly relevant to Formula One was the innovation happening in aviation. As mechanized war took to the skies en masse for the first time, engines that went faster, ran more reliably, and used less fuel became vital to the survival of their pilots. These new technologies and design aims were also applied to Formula One engines, and those same engineers helped push the power of Formula One cars to completely new levels. In the early 1950s, the use of supercharged engines was prevalent. Supercharging involved forcing more air into the combustion chamber, allowing for increased power output. Alfa Romeo's dominant 158-159, for example, utilized a supercharger straight-A engine. However, as the decade progressed, there was a shift towards naturally aspirated engines. The decision to move away from supercharging was driven by a desire for improved fuel efficiency and reliability. Naturally aspirated engines, which rely on the engine's inherent ability to draw in air, became the norm. This transition played a crucial role in shaping the future of Formula One. Unlike modern Formula One, there was also a variety of engine configurations used as the rules were less prescriptive. There were straight-8s, V12s, and even the occasional inline-4 engine on the grid. Each configuration had its own set of advantages and challenges. For example, the Alfa Romeo 158-59 featured a powerful straight-A engine, while Ferrari's 375 F1 was equipped with a potent V12. The choice of engine configuration often depended on factors such as weight distribution, power delivery characteristics, and the engineering preferences of individual teams. Engineers were experimenting with different layouts to find the optimal balance between power and reliability. And it was reliability that became such a significant concern, as teams realized the importance of completing races without mechanical failures. After all, there are no points given out to the car that retires from first place with just one lap left. The grueling nature of Formula One races in the 50s, with circuits like the Nürburgring demanding exceptional durability from the engines, prompted a focus on building more robust powertrains. Technological advancements in materials, lubrication systems, and cooling mechanisms played a pivotal role in enhancing the reliability of Formula One engines. Teams invested time and resources in developing engines that could withstand the demanding conditions of competitive racing. These early innovations in Formula One engines gave it a place in the motoring world that the sport still holds today. Formula One leads the globe in engine innovation, and that was true even in the 1950s. It wasn't just the engines that saw incredible advancement, though. Aerodynamics became a focal point of car design in the 1950s, with teams experimenting with streamlined shapes to reduce drag and increase speed. The quest for improved aerodynamic efficiency led to the introduction of enclosed wheels, smoother bodywork, and distinctive tail fins on some cars. These definitely weren't wings though, which wouldn't appear on a Formula One car until the late 60s. Suspension systems underwent significant improvements in the 1950s as well, with a shift towards independent suspension systems. This allowed each wheel to move independently, improving overall handling and traction. Chassis design also evolved with the introduction of space frames and tubular structures, contributing to both rigidity and lightness. All this innovation off the track was for one simple goal: to create an incredible car to compete in, and there were some unbelievable competitors in the 1950s. As the decade unfolded, Formula One delivered a plethora of unforgettable moments that resonated with fans and solidified the sport's status as the pinnacle of motorsport. At the time, races were rarely live broadcasted, though the 1953 British Grand Prix is believed to have been the first. Instead, recorded footage was cut into highlight reels, or journalists would do write-ups in the papers for the masses to read. It was through these mediums that the world followed the first heroic stories from the Formula One world. While 1950 may have been the inaugural season of Formula One, it was the story of Fangio in 1951 that really set the world alight. His 3 wins and 2 second places gave him a 6-point lead over Albert Ascari at the end of the season. His Alfetta 159 dominated the rest of the field, with an engine producing around 420 brake horsepower, an impressive figure for the time. This was at the price of a fuel consumption of 125 to 175 litres per 100 kilometres, or 1.88 miles per gallon to 1.34 miles per gallon. Despite their dominant car, Alfa Romeo was government-owned at the time, and in the post-war world, the Italian government couldn't afford to spend the money on designing a new car for 1952. So Fangio and Alfa Romeo left Formula One, leaving a void that Ferrari happily filled with Alberto Ascari behind the wheel. You may have heard that name before at Monza, where the chicane made up of turns 8, 9 and 10 are named after him. Excluding the Indy 500, which was a part of the Formula One World Championship but completely ignored by the competing teams, those early seasons were entirely based in Europe until 1953. The opening race of the season was held in Argentina, and from that year onwards, there has always been at least one race outside of Europe every year. As with modern Formula One, changing regulations brought a change in the teams participating, and in 1954 the introduction of a new 2.5-litre atmospheric engine regulation brought Lancia and Mercedes-Benz to the sport, hiring the best drivers of the era, Ascari for Lancia and Fangio for Mercedes. Those Mercedes cars, especially the one driven by Fangio, would dominate the championship for the next 2 years, but at the end of 1955, the team would disappear from Formula One as a constructor for 55 years, until they took over the Brawn GP team in 2010. They made the decision to withdraw after a crash involving one of their cars at Le Mans that year killed 83 people. After that incident, 4 of the remaining Grand Prix were cancelled as motorsport looked for ways to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. 1955 was not a good year for Formula One. Earlier that year at the Monaco Grand Prix, a spectacular incident saw Alberto Ascari and his Lancia crash into the harbour after missing a chicane. Ascari was pulled out of the water alive and apparently well. However, there was speculation over an undetected internal injury, when 4 days later Ascari was killed at Monza while testing a sports car. After Ascari's death, Lancia followed Mercedes out of the category, passing their engines, cars, information and technology to Ferrari. Lancia and Mercedes' exit from the sport left Formula One very short on respected constructors. The only names you would recognise today in the 1956 season were Ferrari and Maserati. Apart from those two, it was mostly privateer operations and one-off races from brands like BRM and Bugatti. 1958 saw one of the biggest changes in Formula One history, which changed the sport into something more recognisable today. 1958 saw the introduction of an international cup for F1 manufacturers, with points allocated on an 8-6-4-3-2-1 basis to the first 6 cars in the race. Also, points were only awarded to the highest placed car of each make, so if a Ferrari finished first and second, they would receive only 8 points, and the third place car would receive 4 points. The first ever winner of what we now know as the Constructors' Championship was a company called Van Wall, with the help of some excellent results from Stirling Moss. The British manufacturer and race team couldn't quite get Moss over the line in the Drivers' Championship though, which was won by Mike Hawthorn, becoming the first British driver to win the championship, and heralding the start of decades of British constructor dominance in Formula One. Moss may have won that 1958 Drivers' Championship, a title that his reputation definitely deserved, if it hadn't been for his impeccable sportsmanship. When Hawthorn was threatened with disqualification at the finish of the Portuguese Grand Prix for going in the wrong direction while restarting his car after a spin, Moss argued to the stewards on Hawthorn's behalf and got the disqualification turned over. Mike would win the championship by a single point, and meaning Moss's actions in Portugal made all the difference. 1958 also saw a woman driving in Formula One for the first time, with Maria Teresa de Filippis racing a private Maserati at the Belgian Grand Prix. The end of the 1950s saw another monumental change in Formula One. Up until that point, racing cars had always had the engines mounted in the front of the car, but in 1958, when Stirling Moss won the Argentine Grand Prix, it was the first victory for a car with the engine mounted behind the driver in Formula One. That was also the first time a Formula One car would win a race with an engine provided by a different company to the chassis, something that would go on to be a feature of Formula One till this day. As a mid-engine revolution began in Formula One at the end of the 1950s, Ferrari lagged behind, with Enzo Ferrari famously claiming, "The horses pull the car rather than push it." But come the 1960s, he would be proven more wrong than he could ever have imagined. In the swinging 60s, an era synonymous with cultural revolution and societal upheaval, a different kind of revolution was unfolding on the racetracks of Formula One. The British were asserting their dominance, not just in the corridors of power and pop culture, but also on the asphalt of the Grand Prix circuits. The 1960s in Formula One was a period of remarkable transformation, marked by the rise of iconic teams like Lotus and BRM, the evolution of cutting-edge technology, the emergence of legendary drivers such as Jim Clark and Graham Hill, and the growing concerns about safety as speeds reached unprecedented levels. The British racing scene in the 1960s was akin to a fertile breeding ground for innovation and success. The emergence of Lotus as a formidable force reshaped the landscape of Formula One. Under the visionary leadership of Colin Chapman, Lotus became synonymous with innovation, pushing the boundaries of technology and design. Chapman's mantra, "Simplify, then add lightness," became the guiding principle for Lotus cars, and it was a philosophy that bore fruit on the racetrack. Lotus not only introduced innovative designs, but also produced exceptional drivers. The indomitable Jim Clark, with his boyish charm and steely determination, became the face of Lotus and a symbol of British racing prowess. Clark's World Championship wins in 1963 and 65 in the Lotus Climax marked a turning point in Formula One, solidifying the team's reputation as a powerhouse. At the time, Ferrari were producing heavy but powerful cars which may have outclassed the smaller British cars in a drag race, but around a track where the cars had to be able to turn a corner, they were nowhere near them. Although down on power, the British car's superior handling and lesser demands on tyres more than made up for the power deficit. It was obvious to everyone from very early on in the 60s that the age of the front-engine car was over, and that rear or mid-engine cars were the way to go. Another British contender that left an indelible mark on the 1960s Formula One landscape was British Racing Motors, or BRM. The BRM V8 engine and the elegant BRM P261 chassis became synonymous with speed and sophistication. Drivers like Graham Hill, who later earned the moniker Mr. Monaco for his prowess on the street circuit, brought glory to BRM and contributed to the narrative of British dominance in Formula One. While the 60s was dominated by British cars, they weren't always driven by British drivers. Jack Brabham took the last driver's title of the 50s driving for Cooper Climax, and he would take the first of the 60s as well. In 1962, he established his own Brabham team with fellow Australian Ron Taranach, which in the 1960s became the largest manufacturer of custom racing cars in the world. In the 1966 Formula One season, Brabham became the first and still the only man to win the Formula One World Championship, driving one of his own cars. As the thrill of speed and competition intensified in the 1960s, so did the inherent risks associated with the sport. The era witnessed several tragic incidents that served as wake-up calls for the racing community. The quest for speed pushed both man and machine to the limits, often with devastating consequences. One of the most poignant moments in Formula One history occurred in 1961, when German driver Wolfgang von Trips, competing for Ferrari, lost control of his car at the Italian Grand Prix in Monza. The car careened into the crowd, resulting in the death of von Trips and 15 spectators. The tragedy underscored the urgent need for improved safety measures. In response to such incidents, the FIA began to prioritize safety. The 1960s witnessed the introduction of mandatory safety measures, such as fire-resistant suits and helmets for drivers. Additionally, circuits underwent modifications to enhance safety, including the installation of barriers and runoff areas. It was the sheer speed of the cars, though, that created the most danger. In 1961, in an attempt to curb speeds, Formula One was downgraded to 1.5-litre non-supercharged engines, a formula which would remain for the next 5 years. Despite the changes made to the sport and more of a focus on driver safety than ever before, accidents still happened. On the 7th of April 1968, Jim Clark, winner of the 1963 Drivers' Championship and one of the most successful and popular drivers of the time, was killed at Hockenheim in West Germany at a non-championship Formula 2 event. The Scotsman had gone off track, caused by what was believed to be a deflating rear tyre. At the time, 90% of the Hockenheim circuit was made up of two long, slightly curving straights, running through thick forests. There was no protection from the solid trees lining the circuit on both sides, so when Clark's Lotus left the track, it smashed into a wall of trees, breaking the Scotsman's neck and killing him instantly. the car was totally destroyed. While safety did improve throughout the 60s, there was a bigger, more noticeable revolution happening. If Formula One technology had leapt forward in the 50s, then it flew in the 60s. One of the key drivers of change was the exploration of aerodynamics in ways that racing teams had never before considered. Teams began to realize the critical role aerodynamics played in achieving higher speeds and better handling. The introduction of wings and spoilers marked a departure from traditional design, with engineers experimenting to find the optimal balance between downforce and drag. It was, of course, a British team that would fit the first wing, when Colin Chapman introduced modest front wings and a spoiler on Graham Hill's Lotus 49B at the 1968 Monaco Grand Prix. Brabham and Ferrari did not want to be left behind though, and went one better at the 1968 Belgian Grand Prix, with full-width wings mounted on struts high above the driver. Lotus replied with a full-width wing directly connected to the rear suspension that required a redesign of suspension wishbones and transmission shafts. By the end of the season, most teams were using sophisticated wings. The speed at which teams innovated and the lack of digital modeling meant that a lot of this innovation was trial and error, and it led to some very peculiar-looking cars. These distinctive wings would become a hallmark of Formula One cars for the rest of the sport's history, and added to the impression that these cars were beyond what you could buy. Just like the 50s, the 60s had its fair share of drivers that would go on to become legends of Formula One. One of those was the Scotsman Jim Clark. Jim Clark's journey into the world of motorsport began on the unpaved roads of his family's farm, where he developed an innate understanding of vehicle dynamics at an early age. His foray into competitive racing came in the form of rallies and hill climbs, where his experience as a youth was vital and his natural talent quickly became evident. In the late 1950s, Clark transitioned to circuit racing, initially competing in sports cars and touring cars. His breakthrough moment, however, came when he joined the Lotus team in 1960. Under the guidance of the legendary Colin Chapman, Clark found his racing home and a platform to showcase his extraordinary abilities. Clark's debut in Formula One in 1960 started slowly, but quickly that changed. Although the first season was marked by a mix of success and mechanical failures, it laid the groundwork for what was to come. The turning point arrived in 1962 when Clark secured his first Formula One victory at the Belgian Grand Prix, driving the iconic Lotus 25. It was his first of 3 that season. What set Clark apart was not just his ability to win races, but the manner in which he did so. His driving style was characterized by a smooth and precise approach, earning him the nickname the Flying Scot. Clark's finesse behind the wheel was such that he could extract maximum performance from his car, while seemingly holding something back to save his car from reliability problems, a rare balance that set him apart from his peers. The years 1963 and 1965 witnessed Clark's ascension to the pinnacle of Formula One, as he clinched the World Drivers' Championship in both seasons. In the Lotus Climax and Lotus Ford cars, Clark showcased an unmatched dominance, securing victories with an almost serene ease. His triumph in 1965 was particularly noteworthy, as he won 6 out of the season's 10 races. Despite his success, Clark remained humble and unassuming off the track. His quiet demeanor and lack of ostentation earned him the reputation of a gentleman racer, endearing him to fans and fellow competitors alike. This humility, however, belied the intense competitor within. Beyond his accomplishments on the track, Jim Clark's legacy extends to his advocacy for safety in motorsports. The 1960s were an era marked by tragic accidents, and Clark, having lost friends and fellow drivers, became a vocal proponent for improved safety measures. His influence played a pivotal role in the ongoing evolution of safety standards within Formula One. Clark's tragic death in 1968 at the age of 32 sent shockwaves through the racing world. A tyre failure during a Formula 2 race at the Hockenheim Ring led to a fatal crash that cut short the career of one of the sport's brightest stars. The loss of Jim Clark reverberated far beyond the racetrack, leaving an enduring impact on Formula One. In the words of fellow racer Jackie Stewart, Jim Clark was not just a driver, he was an artist. Like Clark, Stewart was another Scotsman who rose to fame in the 60s and is still a respected figure on the grid today. Stewart's journey into motorsports began in the late 1950s, initially in the realm of British club racing. His innate talent quickly garnered attention, leading to an opportunity to compete in Formula 3. His success in this category paved the way for a Formula One debut in 1965 with the Owen Racing organization. Despite facing initial challenges and skepticism, Stewart showcased his prowess by securing a race win in his maiden season at the Italian Grand Prix. It was a preview of what was to come, an illustrious career marked by a meticulous approach to racing and an unyielding commitment to excellence. Stewart joined the Matra International team in 1968. Ken Tyrrell, who was behind Jackie's entry to motorsport at the very start of his career, became team principal of the team that same year, and the partnership proved to be a turning point in Jackie's career, as Stewart found himself in a team that not only believed in his potential, but also shared his vision for success. In 1969, he clinched his first Formula One World Championship, marking the beginning of an era of dominance. It was a dominant season for Jackie as well, who won 6 of the 11 Grand Prix that year. He almost doubled the points of second-place Jackie Ickx and tripling the points haul of his teammate Jean-Pierre Beltois. While Jackie and Jim were legends of the 60s, it is perhaps Graham Hill who left the largest mark on Formula One and motorsport history. Starting as a mechanic, he quickly transitioned to racing in the late 1950s, climbing the ranks of British motorsport. Though he drove in F1 in the final years of the 50s, it wasn't until 1962 that Hill really showed what he was made of. Driving on the same team as Jim Clark, the two duelled over the Drivers' Championship that whole season. At the second Grand Prix of the season in Monaco, Clark started on pole position, but as would be the story of much of his season, he retired from the race with reliability problems, in this case a clutch failure. Clark would retire from 4 of the 9 Grand Prix that season, winning 3 of the 5 he started, giving Hill, who managed to finish every race, the championship victory. Hill's victory at the Dutch Grand Prix that season marked the first Grand Prix win for a British driver in a British car since 1957. Graham Hill's driving style was characterized by a meticulous approach and a calm demeanor behind the wheel. His ability to navigate challenging circuits with precision and strategic acumen set him apart from his peers. It was these skills that helped him finish so many of the races he started, which was something not common at the time. As the 1960s progressed, Hill's talent matured, and he became synonymous with consistency and calculated aggression. However, Hill's true moment of glory came in 1968 when he secured his second World Championship. The season was marked by fierce competition, with Hill facing challenges from the likes of Jackie Stewart and Denny Hulme. The season went right down to the wire, with Hill leading Stewart by just 3 championship points before the final race of the season in Mexico. With 9 points for a win and 6 for second at the time, all Jackie had to do was win and he would triumph over Graham on races 1. Despite the intense rivalry, Hill's consistent performance and his eventual triumph at the Mexican Grand Prix secured his place in the annals of Formula One history. What truly set Graham Hill apart, though, was his exceptional versatility across different racing disciplines. Hill's prowess wasn't confined to Formula One. He also excelled in endurance racing and sports cars. In 1972, he achieved the pinnacle of success by winning the prestigious 24 Hours of Le Mans alongside co-driver Henri Pescarolo. The win at the famous endurance race earned him the first and only ever elusive Triple Crown of motorsport, winning the Monaco Grand Prix, the Indianapolis 500, and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The trifecta of victories solidified Hill's legacy as one of the most versatile and accomplished drivers in the history of motorsports. To this day, the feat still hasn't been replicated, though Fernando Alonso came extremely close during his short hiatus from Formula One, but failed to win the Indy 500, retiring from the lead of the race very late on in 2017. The 1969 Monaco Grand Prix was a particularly poignant moment in Hill's career. Racing for Lotus, he secured his 5th and final victory in Monaco, further cementing his status as the undisputed king of the Principality. Hill's ability to conquer the intricacies of the Monaco circuit made him a beloved figure not just among racing enthusiasts, but also among the Monegasque people. The 1960s weren't just marked by British dominance, technical innovation, and legendary drivers, though. At the time, it was widely accepted that racing came with a real risk of severe injury or death, and it took some time before the culture of striving to protect lives set in. It wasn't just drivers at risk either, it was the spectators and stewards as well. 3-time world champion Jackie Stewart played an important part in the push for safety during some of F1's most dangerous years. advocating mandatory seatbelts and full-face helmets, as well as for better barriers and proper medical teams. There was also the introduction of the first rollover bars to Formula 1 cars, saving the lives of countless drivers who flipped their cars. Jackie and the rest of the drivers' quest for better safety measures led to the cancellation of the Belgian Grand Prix in 1969. Before the race, they had requested changes to the circuit for safety purposes, but after the organisers refused, they decided to boycott the race. The boycott of the race at the time was taken very poorly by the media. Motorsport's Dennis Jenkinson wrote, "I've always thought that one of the enduring features of a Grand Prix driver was that he has guts and would accept a challenge that normal people like you and I would not be brave enough to face. Now, I'm not sure." Jackie was all too familiar with the dangers of the circuit at Spa. In 1966, more than half the field crashed out of the race on the first lap due to an incredible rainstorm. Jackie Stewart's BRM P261 crashed into a telephone pole and then landed in a ditch at the Master Kink, leading to him being stuck upside down in his BRM halfway up to his waist in fuel for 25 minutes. Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant, both of whom had gone off near Stewart, eventually managed to rescue him with a spectator's toolkit. Despite there only being 7 cars left of the 16 that started the race at the end of the first lap, the entire loop was run under green flag conditions. There was one other change in the late 60s that reshaped how Formula 1 looked. One of the biggest drivers of the Formula 1 carousel is money. Money is the fuel for technological development and performance finding. Without money, Formula 1 isn't the cutting edge of automotive technology. Today, F1 is a multi-billion-dollar business, but there was a time when stable owners and drivers had to earn their money without sponsors and massive contracts. The revolution in this field was brought about by the arrival of rich sponsors in the late 60s, mainly from the tobacco and oil companies. The first ever team to take to the grid with an advertisement was the private South African team Gunston, which entered a Brabham car in the Gunston cigarette livery for their 1968 home Grand Prix. At the very next Spanish Grand Prix, the first Lotus factory team took up the idea, wearing the red, gold and white colours of Imperial Tobacco's gold leaf cigarettes. And thus began a new era, in which the money of rich sponsors played a major role. As the 1960s drew to a close, Formula 1 had undergone a remarkable transformation. The British dominance, characterised by teams like Lotus and BRM, had reshaped the competitive landscape. Technological innovations in aerodynamics and rear-engine placement had propelled the sport into a new era of speed and sophistication. The iconic drivers of the 1960s, including the legendary Jim Clark and Graham Hill, had etched their names into the annals of racing history. Their on-track exploits and off-track charisma had elevated Formula 1 to a global spectacle, captivating audiences far beyond the racetracks. Yet the era was not without its somber moments. The quest for speed had exacted a toll, claiming the lives of talented drivers and innocent spectators. The tragedies of the 1960s forced the sport to confront its vulnerabilities and spurred a concerted effort to prioritize safety. As Formula 1 hurtled into the 1970s, the legacy of the 60s lingered. The lessons learned from triumphs and tragedies alike shaped the trajectory of the sport.
Brabham takes the lead, with Ickx trying to take him up the hill, Ickx powering the Ferrari up on the inside of Drew.
The 1970s marked a transformative and dynamic era in the world of Formula 1, a period characterized by technological innovation, fierce competition, iconic drivers, and profound changes in the sport's landscape. Known as the Formula 1 Golden Age, the 1970s were fiercely competitive, with legendary drivers such as Emerson Fittipaldi, Jackie Stewart, James Hunt, and Niki Lauda writing themselves into the sporting history books. 1979 witnessed the first and only Formula 1 champion from the African continent when Jody Scheckter drove his Ferrari 312 to victory. As with the previous decades, it wasn't just on track that Formula 1 evolved. The relentless march in pursuit of performance continued in the factories of Europe as money flooded the sport like never before. This was the era of the Playboy Formula 1 driver. Salaries grew exponentially as teams and drivers gorged themselves on sponsorship deals, and with the risk of death being as great as ever, Formula 1 drivers lived life like rock stars. The incredible increase in money in Formula 1 happened for a few different reasons, and it would go on to define the entire decade for the sport. In the early 1970s, the world of Formula One underwent a seismic shift as commercialization took the sport by storm. What was once a gentleman's pursuit fueled by passion and craftsmanship evolved into a high-stakes battleground for sponsors and television networks. The smell of burning rubber and the roar of engines echoed not just on the racetracks, but across living rooms globally. Formula One had long been synonymous with speed and glamour, but the 1970s saw a new player take center stage: sponsorship. As the cost of developing cutting-edge technology soared, teams sought financial backing from corporations eager to showcase their brands on the world stage. The once pristine racing cars were now adorned with logos, turning the sleek vehicles into rolling billboards. While Gunston had started this in 1968 with their cigarette sponsorship, it was in the 1970s that sponsorship really blew up. One of the trailblazers in this new era was Lotus, whose striking black and gold livery became an iconic symbol of the changing times. John Player Special, a cigarette brand, became synonymous with the team, and their sponsorship marked the beginning of a trend that would shape the sport for decades to come. That John Player Special livery is still seen as one of the most iconic and good-looking cars in F1 history. As the sport became globalized with the growing popularity of television, something we'll come back to, brands saw the chance to use sport for marketing. Motorsport sponsorship coincided with a growing need for corporate awareness. Companies wanted to be known by as many people as possible. The more people that knew that Gunston or John Player Special existed, the more people that might buy their products or remember to buy more. Formula One sponsorship became a very powerful tool for this. F1, with a passionate and vast following, is the perfect canvas on which to post one's logo and name, and to paint in one's brand colors. F1 cars were easy real estate. They were covered in surfaces perfect for presenting a logo to anyone who saw an image or a live picture of the car. There were issues though. The low quality of television cameras at the time and the speed of the cars meant that the clarity of a brand image or name wasn't always perfect, but that speed was also an advantage. Speed and danger were perceived as masculine, courageous, fascinating and rebellious. F1 was cool, and cigarette companies wanted to be associated with that. Formula One became the global billboard of the cigarette industry in the 70s and for decades after that. From the mid-1970s onwards, the brands of Goodyear, Agyip, Magneti Marelli and Champion began to appear with increasing frequency on the liveries of F1 cars, promoting for the first time the technological side of the racing system. Because, sure, racing was manly, glamorous and synonymous with courage, but it was also a center for cutting-edge technology and mechanics. Being part of that world meant being able to promote one's product as something excellent and cutting-edge, which was transferred from the racetrack to the everyday street. This explosion in sponsorship would never have happened if it wasn't for Formula One's growing global reach. Television coverage was transforming the way fans experienced Formula One. As the sport reached new heights of popularity, broadcasters recognized its potential as a ratings juggernaut. The sight of sleek cars navigating challenging circuits at breakneck speeds captivated audiences, and networks clamored to secure broadcasting rights. The marriage between Formula One and television brought the sport into the living rooms of millions, creating a global fanbase. Legendary commentators like Murray Walker lent their voices to the drama unfolding on the track, turning races into must-watch events. The sport's commercialization not only filled team coffers but also elevated Formula One from a niche interest to a worldwide phenomenon. Those new fans were treated to some of the most dramatic and entertaining racing that Formula One has ever seen, though it started in the worst possible way. Jochen Rindt's death in 1970 remains one of the darkest moments in the history of Formula One. The fatal accident occurred during the second practice session for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Rindt was driving the Lotus 72, a car that had proven to be competitive throughout the season. Aerodynamic downforce was not yet properly understood, and the car was, according to his teammate John Miles, rather unstable and difficult to drive. Ultimately though, it was a brake system failure that caused Rindt to spin off, going into the parabolica, and crash into a poorly installed Armco barrier. The car went under the barrier and rotated a few times in the sand trap. The impact of the crash caused a failure in Rindt's seatbelt, and despite the safety measures in place, he suffered fatal injuries. He wasn't wearing the crotch strap of his seatbelt, and the straps were loose, which made the failure more likely to happen. The lack of a full-face helmet at the time also contributed to the severity of his injuries. As a result, he slipped down in the car and the belt buckle caused fatal throat injuries. Before that, Jochen Rindt had had an outstanding season, winning 5 of the 9 races leading up to the Italian Grand Prix. His performance had earned him a significant lead in the championship standings, and following his death, he became the first and only driver in Formula 1 history to posthumously win the World Championship. Rindt's points lead was insurmountable, and no other driver could catch up by the end of the season. Rindt's tragic death had a profound impact on Formula 1 and led to a renewed emphasis on safety. The incident prompted changes in safety regulations, including improvements in helmet design and construction, as well as a re-evaluation of seatbelt systems. These changes aim to prevent similar accidents and enhance the overall safety of drivers in the sport. Jochen Rindt is remembered not only for his talent as a driver, but also for the circumstances surrounding his championship win. His legacy lives on in Formula 1, serving as a poignant reminder of the importance of continually advancing safety measures to protect the lives of drivers. Jochen Rindt's untimely death marked a turning point in the sport, prompting a commitment to ongoing safety improvements that continue to be a priority in Formula 1 and motorsports as a whole. Sadly, the 1970s bore witness to more fatal accidents than just Rindt's. The dangers inherent in the sport were tragically illustrated by incidents like the crashes of Roger Williamson at the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix. It was only Roger's second race in Formula 1, and on his 8th lap, a suspected tyre failure at the high-speed S's near the East Tunnel caused his car to flip upside down and catch fire. Williamson had not been seriously injured by the impact, but was trapped under the car, which was swiftly engulfed in flames. The track marshals were both poorly trained and badly equipped and did not assist him. Another driver, David Purley, upon witnessing the crash of his friend, abandoned his own race and pulled over in a desperate and valiant attempt to rescue Williamson. He ran across the still active track to Williamson's car and tried to turn it upright, before grabbing a fire extinguisher from a marshal and returning to the engulfed car. He emptied it on the car and signaled for others to help. Purley's efforts to turn the car upright and extinguish the flames were in vain, and the marshals were unable to handle the vehicle without flame-retardant overalls. Purley later stated he could hear Williamson's screams from underneath the car, but by the time the first fire engine arrived and the fire was extinguished, Williamson had died of asphyxiation. Tom Pryce's crash at the 1977 South African Grand Prix was another terrible accident. He collided at high speed with a safety marshal, Frederik Jansen van Vuren, and both men were killed. Frederik had been crossing the track with a fire extinguisher to try and save another driver who was stuck in a car that had caught fire. Pryce had been following another car closely, and while the driver in front of him had time to avoid Frederik, Pryce did not. Pryce hit Frederik at about 170 miles an hour, killing him instantly, while the fire extinguisher the 19-year-old marshal had been carrying hit the driver in the head, also killing him on impact. These incidents not only claimed the lives of talented drivers, but forced the sport to confront its own mortality. The visceral impact of these accidents, now broadcasted to a global audience, prompted calls for increased safety measures and a reassessment of the risks involved in high-speed racing. The FIA, Formula 1's governing body, took a more active role in enforcing safety standards. Stricter regulations were put in place to ensure that the sport could retain its excitement while minimizing the risks to drivers. The tragic lessons of the 1970s paved the way for an era of continuous improvement in safety protocols which carries on to this day. While there were tragedies on track during the 70s, there was also some incredible racing and rivalries, including one of Formula 1's most famous. Niki Lauda and James Hunt. These two legendary drivers captivated the world during the 1976 Formula 1 season, a year forever etched in the annals of motorsport history. Lauda and Hunt possessed contrasting personalities and driving styles, yet their fierce rivalry ignited a captivating narrative that continues to intrigue fans to this day. Niki Lauda, born in Austria in 1949, was a focused and methodical driver who approached racing with meticulous precision. His disciplined approach earned him success in lower racing categories and paved his way to Formula 1. Starting in a Mini in 1968, he crashed his way through Formula V and Formula 3, and in 1972, he bought his way into the March Formula 2 and Formula 1 teams, with a bank loan secured by his life insurance policy. The uncompetitive marches meant Nicky was unable to prove his worth as a driver, let alone stave off pending bankruptcy. With no qualifications in any other line of work, he had no choice but to keep on racing. For 1973, he talked his way into a complicated rent-to-ride deal with BRM. During that season, his ever-improving results paid dividends in the form of a new contract that would forgive his debts in exchange for Nicky staying with BRM for a further 2 years. Instead, he bought his way out of BRM with money from his new employer, Enzo Ferrari, for whom he went to work in 1974. This unapologetic, risk-it-all career path tells the story of a man with a singular mindset, determined to succeed whatever the cost, and a drive that can only be matched by Formula 1's greatest drivers. James Hunt, on the other hand, was a charismatic and flamboyant Englishman, known for his playboy lifestyle and daredevil driving style. He possessed an innate talent behind the wheel and showcased remarkable car control from a young age. As Hunt himself once said in a 1976 interview, when asked about his playboy status, define a playboy. I don't know, I like playing. Hunt reveled in the perks that accompanied his status as a Formula 1 superstar. He boasted about his escapades, claiming to have slept with over 5,000 women, often indulging in sexual encounters mere minutes before sliding behind the wheel for a race. A photograph from 1976 captures Hunt wearing a patch on his racing uniform that unabashedly declares, "Sex is a high-performance thing." Another patch adorning his attire reads, "Sex, breakfast of champions." As the commercialization wave swept through Formula 1, the two contrasting figures emerged as the poster boys for the sport. The 1976 Formula 1 season became one of the most remembered in history because of the rivalry between Niki Lauda and James Hunt. The first chapter of this thrilling battle took place at the Brazilian Grand Prix. James Hunt, the charismatic and daring British driver, was ready to leave his mark on the racing world driving for McLaren. At the other end of the pit lane stood Niki Lauda in the Ferrari garage, the cool and calculating Austrian, known for his technical brilliance and unwavering focus. As the season progressed, the rivalry between Hunt and Lauda intensified. Each race became a battleground where these idols of the track pushed themselves to the limits. The Monaco Grand Prix witnessed Hunt's daring maneuvers through the narrow streets, while Lauda showcased his precision and control. However, the story took a dramatic turn at the infamous Nürburgring circuit in Germany. In treacherous, wet conditions, Lauda's Ferrari suffered a horrifying crash engulfed in flames. Miraculously surviving, Lauda faced severe injuries, including extensive burns. The racing world held its breath as the Austrian fought for his life. His racing career was completely written off, and it seemed the title would be won by Hunt with ease. However, Niki was a fighter. His ascension to the sport had proved that. Bankruptcy hadn't stopped him, and a few burns certainly weren't going to hold him back either. As Lauda battled to recover, Hunt faced a moral dilemma. Would he press on with the competition, taking advantage of his rival's misfortune, or would he wait for Lauda to return to the track? The answer would reveal the true character of these racing gladiators. Against all odds, Niki Lauda defied medical expectations and made a miraculous return to racing just 6 weeks later at the Italian Grand Prix. In the meantime, Hunt had won in Germany, secured 4th in Austria, and won again in the Netherlands. To be a Formula 1 champion, you have to be ruthless, and James was proving that. The sight of Niki, scarred but unbroken, was a testament to his indomitable spirit. Lauda would initially struggle after returning from the crash, finishing 4th in Italy and failing to score points in Canada, before stepping onto the podium again at Watkins Glen with a 3rd-placed finish. In those 3 races, James retired once and won twice. The stage was set for a gripping finale at the Japanese Grand Prix in Fuji. The championship was to be decided in Japan at the fast Fuji Speedway near Tokyo, and Lauda was leading Hunt by 3 points. In qualifying, Hunt took 2nd, but Lauda was right behind in 3rd, as Andretti took pole for Lotus. On race day, it rained heavily, and the weather was dreadful, with the track full of water and the rain pelting down. Hunt got a good start and took the lead from Andretti in the appalling conditions. Conditions that were far too bad to race in. At the end of the 2nd lap, Lauda came into the pits and withdrew, saying that the conditions were just too dangerous to drive in. Hunt persevered through the wet, though, to finish the race in third place and win the Drivers' Championship. The 1976 Formula One season etched itself into the history books as one of the most dramatic and memorable chapters in racing lore. The rivalry between James Hunt and Niki Lauda transcended sport, becoming a symbol of perseverance, resilience, and the unyielding spirit of competition. While the two were painted as bitter rivals in the movie Rush, an adaptation of the 1976 season, the two were actually firm friends off the track. They both respected each other as incredible drivers, and the act of risking their lives every time they stepped on track bound them together for life. Seasons like 1976 helped to propel the sport's popularity to new heights, bringing in more sponsors. The increased commercialization of Formula One and the increased money that came with it was perfectly complemented by this incredible battle between two legendary drivers. That increased money also sped up the Formula One development race to unprecedented speeds. The 1970s marked a period of significant technological innovation in Formula One. 1970 saw the first appearance of one of the most recognizable aspects of modern Formula One cars. All the Formula One cars built from 1950 until the end of 1969 had one thing in common: a central air intake in the nose of the car, which supplied the engine with combustion and cooling air. This construction dictated the appearance of the traditional Formula One racing car. At that moment, an alternative didn't seem to exist. But it was the genius car maker Colin Chapman who first entered new territory. He had already pioneered the monocoque design in the early 1960s, which remains universal and indispensable to this day. But in 1970, with his new Lotus 72, the engineer, team chief, and aerodynamic savant did away with the aerodynamically bothersome opening altogether. He made the nose a closed wedge, and the radiators disappeared into the boxes which formed the sides of the car. Thanks to this pioneering invention, the Lotus 72 could travel 14 km an hour faster on long straights than its predecessor, the 49C, even with the same power engine. The grandfather of all modern single-seaters had its debut in Madrid in 1970 for the Spanish Grand Prix. However, the construction suffered teething difficulties and was not capable of producing a win. Lotus driver Jochen Rindt would actually revert to the old 49C car until the Lotus 72 had been developed further. It was at Zandvoort that Jochen Rindt first climbed into the futuristic Lotus 72. At last, the potential of the construction had been brought to life. Rindt won the race and went on to collect maximum points in France, England, and Germany. Rindt's tragic death means the 1970 season will always be remembered for that. But it was also the first time a side-podded Formula One car took to the track, changing the future of the sport forever. 1976 saw the Tyrrell team introduce possibly the most famous Formula One car of all time. The P34's most noticeable feature was that it had 6 wheels, 2 conventional rear drive wheels and 4 at the front. But the success they were seeking did not appear, even though the Centipede did manage to secure a double victory. The technical innovation didn't stop there, though. In July of 1977, Renault brought the first car with a turbocharged engine onto the starting grid. The yellow Renault, piloted by Jean-Pierre Jabouille, began by trailing behind hopelessly. The little 1.5-litre engine started out weak, unreliable, and difficult to drive. The V6 engine's turbo made life difficult for Jean-Pierre. Nevertheless, the French found themselves on the road to success after a while. Around the same time, Lotus boss Colin Chapman was discovering something that only recently re-emerged in Formula One. His Lotus 78 was a groundbreaking design, straight out of the wind tunnel. Strips along the side of the car reached right down to the asphalt. On account of this legal trick, the driving wind flowing beneath the Type 78 was accelerated to such an extent that suction was created, holding the car to the floor and thus enabling it to corner at a phenomenal speed. The concept took no more than a year to mature, and Lotus driver Mario Andretti scooped the championship title with ease in 1978. This was the first ever championship win for a ground effect car. It would only take 4 more years before the development of this technology meant the speed that cars could corner became far too dangerous, and the FIA stepped in and banned them. One of these stranger adaptations of the era was the Brabham BT46. At the start of the 1978 season, the South African designer Gordon Murray fielded a car which, for aerodynamic reasons, had no radiator opening whatsoever. Heat exchanger tiles were stuck to the outside of the racing car in order to keep the oil and water temperature within moderate limits. However, the system only functioned in theory, and the BT-46's engine was already boiling over during test runs prior to the first World Championship race. Much to the distress of the aerodynamics engineers, holes promptly had to be cut into the cladding. As the 1970s drew to a close, Formula One stood at a crossroads. The decade had witnessed the transformation of the sport from a niche interest to a global phenomenon, driven by the forces of commercialization and television coverage. The intense rivalry between Niki Lauda and James Hunt had captured the imagination of fans, elevating the sport to new heights of drama and spectacle. Technological advancements, particularly the introduction of side pods and ground effect floors, had redefined the limits of speed and precision in Formula One. However, this pursuit of performance came at a cost, with tragic accidents underscoring the inherent dangers of high-speed racing. The legacy of the 1970s resonated through the subsequent decades of Formula One. The safety improvements spurred by the tragic events of the era laid the foundation for a sport that could balance the thrill of speed with a commitment to protecting its participants. The commercialization of Formula One continued unabated, with sponsorships and television coverage becoming integral to the sport's identity. In retrospect, the 1970s were a crucible for Formula One, forging its identity through triumphs, rivalries, technological innovations, and tragic losses. As the sport hurtled into the 1980s, it carried with it the lessons of the past, poised to navigate the ever-evolving landscape of motorsport.
And you are seeing on lap 26 a complete change of fortune.
The 80s started very much where the 70s had left off. The 1980s in Formula One marked a transformative period known as the Turbo era, characterized by the widespread adoption of turbocharged engines. Teams and manufacturers sought to harness the additional power provided by turbocharging technology, leading to a significant increase in horsepower and a shift in the dynamics of the sport. The challenges of turbocharged engines were evident in the initial stages of this era. While the power gains were substantial, they came with inherent issues, notably turbo lag and increased stress on engine components. Turbo lag, the delay in power delivery when the driver pressed the throttle, required innovative engineering solutions to minimize its impact. Additionally, the pursuit of higher power outputs led to reliability concerns, with engines prone to failures and technical issues during races. A total of 20 racing teams took part in the competition for World Championship points. With this increase in popularity, the FOCA, or Formula One Constructors Association, led by Brabham boss Bernie Ecclestone, demanded more starting money. Promoters had to give the FOCA $540,000 in order to hold one World Championship race, a model for Formula One that Bernie would use again when he eventually ran the sport. This sum of money was divided up according to the success of each team. The owners of the teams were in dire need of this financial lift because the general technological race had taken off in earnest. In 1980, lap times were reduced by an average of 3 seconds from the previous year, a result in particular of increased cornering speeds enabled by improving ground effect technology. Increased cornering speeds meant more G-force, and this rapid development was a cause of alarm for the drivers. Suddenly, it had become an effort to brace their head against the enormous centrifugal force, and it required more and more strength and concentration to keep their feet on the pedals while cornering. Before the first World Championship race of 1981, the movable spoilers along the bottom of the sides of the vehicles were banned for reasons of safety. Rigid side spoilers with 60mm clearance were introduced in order to reduce the ground effect and with it the cornering speed. Lotus boss and all-round F1 genius Colin Chapman tried to get around this ban in an ingenious manner. He built the Type 88 with a double chassis. When cornering, the vehicle's soft-sprung primary chassis with rigid side spoilers sealed the gap between the secondary chassis and the asphalt. The project consumed a large proportion of the budget but failed to bring the desired success. Officials spotted the trick and banned the Lotus 88 before it could even enter the competition. There was one other invention in 1981 which was absolutely legal and which was a sign of things to come. McLaren and Lotus became the first to build their monocoque out of carbon fiber instead of the conventional aluminium. The benefits in terms of weight savings were the main driving factors behind this change, with improved safety being a secondary bonus to the teams at the time. It was the turbocharged engines of the 80s that really defined the technical progress of the decade though. In 1982, Ferrari had a very competitive turbocharged engine, but the title would be won by Finnish driver Keke Rosberg, driving a Ford Cosworth induction engine-powered Williams. It would be the last induction engine to win a championship till the end of the decade, and Rosberg went down in Formula One history by winning only a single race in the year in which he won the title. The turbo drivers finally assumed control as of 1983. The horsepower ratings of their 1.5-litre engines became immeasurably high. By 1986, the engines had far exceeded the 1,000 horsepower mark. Some engine manufacturers were no longer able to quote exact power output ratings because the scales of the instruments on their test beds were insufficient. The BMW four-cylinder unit, which powered Nelson Piquet to victory in 1983, produced 1,250 horsepower with certainty, and optimists even spoke of 1,300 and 1,400 horsepower. Thanks to this mighty little engine, Gerhard Berger achieved a top speed of 351.2 km an hour, or 218.1 miles per hour in his Benetton BMW, when qualifying for the Italian Grand Prix in Monza. With these incredible engines powering the sport to new speeds, drivers had to be braver and more skilled than ever before, allowing some of the most legendary drivers in the sport's history to flourish. While Ferrari were able to take some wins in the 80s, the decade was really dominated by those driving for McLaren and Williams. Under the leadership of Ron Dennis, McLaren became one of the dominant forces in the sport, achieving success through technical innovation, strong partnerships, and a roster of talented drivers. In the early 1980s, McLaren entered into a partnership with the renowned German sports car manufacturer Porsche. This collaboration marked a crucial period for McLaren as they sought to harness the power of turbocharged engines. The McLaren Tag Porsche MP42, introduced in 1984, featured a powerful Tag-branded Porsche engine. With their new engine, McLaren had a car that was more than capable of winning races, and they had two drivers who were keen to prove it as well. Niki Lauda, the Austrian who had become a three-time Formula One world champion, played a pivotal role in McLaren's success during this era. Lauda returned to Formula One in 1982 after a brief retirement and joined McLaren. He showcased his resilience and skill by securing the Drivers' Championship in 1984, adding to his previous titles with Ferrari. Alain Prost, the French racing driver known for his strategic approach and consistency, joined McLaren in 1984. The partnership between Prost and Lauda, despite their differences in driving style, contributed to McLaren's success. While Lauda managed to claim victory in 1984 over his younger teammate, Prost won the Drivers' Championship in 1985. Showcasing his ability to adapt and deliver consistent performances. In an era defined by a driver's ability to not retire their car, Prost would flourish. Alain Prost's journey in motorsport began in the late 1970s. He competed in karting before progressing to single-seater racing. His talent quickly became evident and he won the French and European Formula Renault Championships in 1976. Prost's rise continued as he moved through the ranks, competing in Formula 3 and Formula 2. His performances caught the attention of the McLaren team and he made his Formula 1 debut with McLaren in 1980. The next 3 seasons were spent at Renault, but Prost returned to McLaren in 1984, forming that legendary partnership with Niki Lauda. The rivalry between the calculating Prost and the resilient Lauda added drama and intrigue to the Formula 1 landscape. The relationship between Lauda and Prost was characterized by mutual respect but also fierce competition. Lauda, known for his experience and strategic approach, was making a comeback while Prost, the rising star of Formula 1, was eager to secure his first world championship. The 1984 season was marked by a closely contested battle between the two McLaren drivers. The season featured 16 races and both Lauda and Prost consistently showcased their skills, collecting points in a highly competitive field. The McLaren Tag Porsche MP42 was a strong and reliable car, allowing both drivers to consistently challenge for victories. The team's dominance was evident as they won 12 out of the 16 races in the season. Lauda, known for his strategic prowess, and Prost engaged in on-track battles and tactical duels. The drivers demonstrated their racing intelligence, often adapting their strategies based on the circumstances of each race. Niki Lauda's consistent performances were a defining factor in the championship battle. Whilst Prost secured more race victories, Lauda's ability to consistently finish on the podium and collect points kept him in contention. The championship battle came down to the final race of the season at the Portuguese Grand Prix in Estoril. Going into the race, Lauda led Prost by 3.5 points. Prost qualified second alongside Nelson Piquet, driving a BMW-powered Brabham, who collected his 9th pole of the season, while Lauda was 11th on the grid. Despite Lauda's lead, he had a lot of work to do to retain his championship title. Lauda climbed up to 3rd after passing Ayrton Senna, who had qualified 3rd in a Toleman. Piquet had fallen away, so Prost was leading with Nigel Mansell 2nd in his last race for Lotus before moving to Williams. Mansell retired due to persistent brake problems and Lauda moved up to 2nd, ensuring his 3rd World Championship. Prost won McLaren's 7th consecutive victory and 12th of 16 races, whilst Lauda finished 2nd, a mere half point in front of Prost in the championship, a record margin that has not been matched since. The podium was completed by Ayrton Senna, who had become a significant figure for McLaren toward the end of the decade. In 1985, Prost got the better of Lauda, whose car seemed almost incapable of finishing a race that season. Prost clinched his first Drivers' Championship with McLaren, solidifying his status as one of the sport's top drivers. Prost would win the Drivers' Championship the following year as well, but the Constructors' title in 1986 would go to Williams, who were a constant challenger to McLaren throughout the decade. Alain Prost became the first driver to successfully defend his World Championship since Jack Brabham, all the way back in 1960 when he won the title in 1986, following a season that climaxed in a classic three-way title fight at the final round in Adelaide. Prost appeared to have little chance against the powerful Williams Hondas of Nigel Mansell and the pre-season favourite Nelson Piquet. With just 18 laps remaining of the season and the title in his grasp, Mansell suffered a spectacular 180-mile-per-hour puncture that ended his hopes. Piquet was then forced to change tyres as a precaution, handing the race and title to a surprised but ecstatic Prost. Williams' year had begun badly when team founder Frank Williams was paralysed in a road accident, but Mansell was a revelation once the season started. He drove with a newly found maturity and speed, winning 4 times and overshadowing his more illustrious new teammate. However, as the Williams teammates fought a tense battle for supremacy, Prost also won 4 races and finished in the points on all but 3 occasions. Although his McLaren was at times no match for the Williams, he was a lapped 3rd at Brands Hatch. Prost's consistency won out over the full season. In the same way that Lauda had beaten him to the title in 1984, Prost managed to keep up with his competitors by simply finishing more races than them. The Williams team would get their own back the following season though, as their superior car couldn't be matched by either Alain Prost or the ever-improving Ayrton Senna. For the 2nd year in a row, Nigel Mansell failed to win the World Championship in dramatic fashion. Mansell's speed was never in question. He recorded more wins, with 6, and more pole positions, with 8 than any of his rivals. But his Williams Honda teammate Nelson Piquet finished in the points more often. So, when Mansell was injured in a spectacular practice accident in Japan, the Brazilian's 3rd World Championship was confirmed. The year began badly for Piquet when a huge practice accident at Tamburello prevented him from starting at Imola. But a combination of podium finishes, lucky wins in Germany and Hungary, and a more convincing display at Monza ultimately gave him an unassailable lead. The high point for Mansell came at Silverstone, where he came from 28 seconds behind Piquet to snatch victory from his teammate with a breathtaking passing manoeuvre into Stowe. Mansell would have to wait until the early 90s to get the Drivers' Championship his skills deserved, because a new phenomenon would come to the fore of Formula 1, as McLaren became the dominant team in the sport once again. Ayrton Senna da Silva was born on March 21, 1960, into a wealthy Brazilian family where, with his brother and sister, he enjoyed a privileged upbringing. He never needed to race for money, but his deep need for racing began with an infatuation with a miniature go-kart his father gave him when he was 4 years old. As a boy, the highlights of Ayrton's life were Grand Prix mornings when he awoke trembling with anticipation at the prospect of watching his Formula 1 heroes in action on television. At 13, he raced a car for the first time and immediately won. 8 years later, he went single-seater racing in Britain, where in 3 years he won 5 championships, by which time he had divorced his young wife and forsaken a future in his father's business in favour of pursuing success in Formula 1 racing, where he made his debut with Toleman in 1984. He would have to wait until 1988 to get into a car truly worthy of his talent though. The McLaren MP44 was just that car. It was the best Formula 1 car in the history of the sport, right up until 2023 when the RB19 gave it its first competition for that claim. With 2 of the sport's greatest ever drivers in Senna and Prost, it's no surprise that the MP44 would win 15 of the 16 Grand Prix in 1988. The McLarens only lost at Monza after Senna crashed with Williams' Jean-Louis Schlesser while lapping him 2 laps from the flag. The Brazilian's misfortune handed victory to the turbocharged Ferraris of Gerhard Berger and Michele Alboreto in the first Italian Grand Prix since the death of Enzo Ferrari in August. However, that was small consolation for the pre-season favourites, who had been so comprehensively beaten by McLaren all year long. Senna's move to McLaren in 1988 marked the beginning of a new era. The combination of McLaren's technical prowess and Honda's dominant engines laid the foundation for a season that would be etched into the history books. From the very start, it was clear that McLaren Honda was in a league of its own. Senna's aggressive yet calculated driving style, coupled with the raw power of the McLaren MP44, led to an unprecedented display of dominance. The car was a masterpiece of engineering, and Senna exploited its potential to the fullest. He was battled to the absolute end though by his teammate Alain Prost. Their on-track duels became the stuff of legend, pushing each other to the limits of skill and strategy. The competition between the two was fierce, adding drama and excitement to every race. As the season progressed, Senna's dominance became increasingly evident. He won 8 out of the 16 races that year, securing pole positions and setting fastest laps. Prost, despite his exceptional skills, found himself playing catch-up as Senna's lead in the championship widened. With 4 races of the season left, it looked like Senna was losing his grip on the title though. Prost won in Portugal and Spain, while Senna failed to even make it to the podium. With 2 races left, the Formula 1 paddock flew to Japan and Suzuka for what would be a decisive race. In a race remembered for its wet conditions and Senna's sheer mastery in the rain, he secured victory and with it the 1988 Drivers' Championship. This triumph marked Senna's first World Championship, a defining moment in his illustrious career. Prost was not a man easily beaten though, and the following year, 1989, saw one of Formula 1's most controversial title battles ever play out. The 1989 season was the start of a new era in F1. Turbocharged engines were banned, with only 3.5-litre Atmo engines allowed now. When looking back on the season, its 16 races can be neatly divided into 4 quarters. Curiously enough, each of those quarters is notable for a different reason. The season started with a major upset when Nigel Mansell won the first race of the season in a Ferrari that up until that moment had shown little reliability in testing. Any hope that the 1989 season would turn into a fight among drivers outside of the 2 McLarens evaporated in the second race of the season though, the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola. The 2 fastest qualifiers, Senna and Prost, made a pre-race agreement that, for safety reasons, the man with the best start would remain unchallenged up to Tosa Corner. The agreement was upheld for the start of the race, but when the race had to restart after Gerhard Berger crashed his Ferrari, the agreement went out of the window. Prost, though, assumed that the agreement was still valid, but when he made the better start, he was instantly passed by Senna, much to the Frenchman's dismay. Senna went on to win the event, but Prost made it more than clear that in his view, Senna had gone too far by not respecting their agreement at the restart. From that point on, the relationship between the two of them deteriorated at a shocking speed. Senna would win the following 2 races in Monaco and Mexico, and looked to be the absolute favourite for the championship. Little would anyone know though that that would be the high point of his season. In the second quarter of the 16-race season, Senna failed to score a single point, while his teammate secured 3 wins. The title race was completely flipped on its head, and in those 4 races, Senna had fallen 20 points behind his teammate, a gap too big for even the legendary Brazilian to assail. The battle between the two was bitter and brutal, with Senna just keeping himself in the title race through the third quarter of the season with wins in Germany and Belgium. The epic battle between the two reached its climax in the controversial Japanese Grand Prix, race 15 of the 16 Grand Prix calendar. Senna had to win to keep alive his hopes of retaining his World Championship crown. However, Suzuka was one of the few races in which Prost was able to outpace his normally quicker teammate, narrowly leading for the majority of the race. Then, on the 47th lap, Senna made an ambitious passing maneuver into the chicane. Prost turned into the corner early to block Senna's advance and the cars collided. Prost stepped out of his car, but Senna returned to the track, pitted, retook the lead and won. However, he was subsequently disqualified for not rejoining the circuit at the point at which he'd left it, and Prost was declared World Championship. The politics surrounding the incident and the disqualification are deep and complex enough to write a book about, and many have been written about it. The relationship between Senna and Prost was in tatters. There was no way they could drive on the same team ever again, and Alain would move to Ferrari. The rivalry between the two drivers would continue to dominate Formula One headlines into the 1990s, until the arrival of a certain German driver would change the landscape of Formula One for an entire decade.
Oh yes! Oh, I don't think... Out goes Michael Schumacher! That didn't work, Michael. You hit the wrong part of him, my friend.
The 1990s saw Formula One begin to transform into something much more akin to the modern sport. The huge amount of monies that teams could throw around meant that reliability was improving rapidly. It became less about having a good car that wouldn't break at the first little bump, and more about just having the fastest possible car with reliability as a given. As the decade unfolded, it witnessed the rise of a new star, the dominance of legendary teams, groundbreaking technical developments, and a series of key moments that would change the sport forever. It is almost impossible to talk about Formula One in the 90s though without starting with probably the sport's most famous driver. Michael Schumacher had won more world championships and races than any other driver by the time he ended a career which spanned 19 seasons. His unparalleled success included occasional moments of deep controversy, from his first world championship in 1994 to his initial retirement from F1 12 years later. He then returned 4 years after with Mercedes, only to retire again at the end of 2012. However, we'll come to all of that in due course. For now, let's look at those early years of his career. Schumacher's debut drive for Jordan at Spa-Francorchamps in 1991 rocked the F1 establishment. Here was a little-known driver from the Mercedes sports car team, qualifying 7th on the grid at one of the most respected circuits on the calendar. Clutch failure ended his race within moments of it starting, and he would never be seen in a Jordan again. It wouldn't be long before he was back on the track though. Flavio Briatore pounced to price Schumacher out of the cockpit and got him into a Benetton for the very next race. The following year, Schumacher successfully interrupted the dominant Williams team's stranglehold on success with an opportunistic win at the track where he made his debut. An off-track excursion gave him the opportunity to observe the state of his teammates' tyres as the damp track dried. Schumacher made a plucky call to switch to slick tyres earlier than his rivals, and his driving skill took care of the rest. It was a sign of things to come from the young German driver, whose car control skills, no matter the conditions, were always impeccable. That was the first of what would eventually be a record-smashing 91 wins. A further win followed in 1993, again snatched from the Williams juggernaut, this time thwarting Alain Prost at Portugal. But in 1994, the way became clear for Schumacher to lay waste to the F1 history books. Most of the recent champions had retired or were retiring. Tragically, 3 races into the season, Ayrton Senna was killed at Imola, an incident we'll come back to shortly. There were other drivers of quality on the grid at the time, of course, and a number of recognisable names. Martin Brundle, Jos Verstappen, Damon Hill, David Coulthard, Irvine, Fittipaldi, Barrichello, Jean Alesi, Hakkinen and Berger. None of them were the equal of young Michael Schumacher though. By the end of the year, he'd won 9 of the 16 races. But his Benetton team were repeatedly accused of cheating. The FIA found evidence of an illegal traction control system on the car. After Schumacher's teammate Jos Verstappen suffered an horrendous fire during the German Grand Prix, an investigation discovered a filter had been removed from his fuel rig. Years later, Verstappen insisted Schumacher's car had not been legal as well. Schumacher was disqualified from the British Grand Prix after overtaking Damon Hill on the formation lap, and was banned from a further 2 races for failing to heed the black flag to begin with. And at Spa, he was stripped of a win for a technical infringement. This left him with a scant 1-point lead heading into the season finale at Adelaide. Under intense pressure from Damon Hill, Schumacher went off and damaged his car. Seeing his promised title slipping away, he swung into the side of Hill's car as the Williams driver moved to pass him, taking both out and securing the title for himself. The season as a whole was actually rather boring in terms of on-track action, but the controversy of the finale and the importance of it being Schumacher's first title have made it legendary. Michael's second title in 1995 was achieved with less controversy and more displays of driving greatness. The season got off to a slow start, but once Schumacher got into his stride, the wins came thick and fast. Hill was simply outclassed, but the pair did clash on track at Silverstone and Monza. In wet conditions at Spa and the Nürburgring, Schumacher produced virtuoso drives, leading many to conclude that in Schumacher, a new F1 great had been found. What his first 2 titles did show was an incredible desire to win no matter the cost. Schumacher was an incredibly aggressive driver throughout his career, but like Vettel, Hamilton and Verstappen after him, it was the early years of his career where that aggression bordered on madness at times. The purposeful crash into Damon Hill in 1994 was the peak of that. Schumacher's next season would be the start of something truly historic though. As the best funded team, with 2 of the best drivers of the era, Nigel Mansell and Alain Prost, Ferrari's 1989 to 1995 V12 F1 cars should easily have been dominant, but internal turmoil, mechanical failures, obsolete engine technology, inept management and poor aerodynamics doomed the team, with a best finish of only second in the 1990 Constructors' Championship. Though the team had been competitive, they hadn't won a Constructors' title since 1983, and the last Drivers' title was won by Jody Scheckter in 1979. Having conquered F1 with Benetton, Schumacher resolved to do it all over again with Ferrari. They were one of F1's great teams, and though they weren't held in the same esteem as they are currently, with a number of other legendary teams competing against them, it was still one of the hottest seats on the grid. Unfortunately, it took Schumacher 5 years to bring the driver's title home to the Scuderia, with a few near misses on the way. It was clear from the outset that little would be achieved with the F310 in its first season at Ferrari. But when the teams assembled at a near-flooded Catalunya circuit for the 7th round of the season, Schumacher was in his element. Rain has always been F1's great leveler, and no matter what the performance of your car, a truly great driver can always find a result in the wet. Michael battled through the field and disappeared off to a dominant victory. He added 2 more by the end of the year at Belgium and Italy. With Benetton ally Ross Brawn rejoining him for 1997, Schumacher was ready for another crack at the title. Brawn was a master of F1 team management, but no matter how good he was at his job, a few months before the season's first race was not long enough to make the F310B a regular race winner. Michael persistently took points off rival Jacques Villeneuve, despite his Williams often enjoying a considerable performance advantage. When rain fell at Monaco and Spa, Schumacher was of course untouchable. The season took a controversial twist at the penultimate race in Suzuka, when Villeneuve collected a hefty penalty for going too quickly through a yellow flag zone. Schumacher's teammate Eddie Irvine, who'd grown used to the idea that he was expected to support rather than rival his teammate, was deployed to help Schumacher win the race and go into the season finale with a 1-point lead. That meant that the final race of the season at Jerez saw a title-deciding battle between Schumacher and Villeneuve. The qualifying session was noteworthy as 3 drivers, Villeneuve, Schumacher and Frentzen, all registered the same fastest qualifying time to the thousandths of a second. Villeneuve was awarded pole position since he'd set the time first. At the start of the race, Schumacher had a good start, overtaking Villeneuve to take the lead. By lap 48 though, Villeneuve in his superior Williams car was catching up to Schumacher and attempted to overtake. Braking later than the German at the dry sack corner, Villeneuve had the inside line and was slightly ahead when Schumacher turned into him, his front right wheel connecting with the side pod of the Williams car. Schumacher retired on the spot and Villeneuve went on to take 3rd place and earn 4 points, enough to take the 1997 title. It was a shocking repeat of the move that earned Schumacher his first title back in 1994. While the result was different this time, and the intentional collision had no effect on the final leadership standings, the governing body had to take action. Schumacher was punished by the FIA for causing an avoidable accident, and was disqualified from the championship, although his race results, such as grid position, finishing position and points, still counted towards his official statistics. They also required him to participate in a road safety initiative, which was probably a bigger punishment in the F1 driver's eyes than the loss of his second-place trophy. He was absolutely vilified for the incident by the media and the public, but that wasn't going to slow him down. In 1998, Schumacher would find himself within touching distance of a trophy with Ferrari once again. It wasn't a Williams in his way this time though, it was another giant of the 90s, a McLaren with Mika Häkkinen behind the wheel. Going into the final race of the season at Suzuka, Michael was just 4 points behind his Finnish rival, meaning that a win would guarantee him the title if Häkkinen finished lower than second. If Häkkinen finished second though, they would be equal on points and the Finn would take the title for most second-place finishes. In the end though, the maths mattered not. Schumacher started from pole position, only to face demotion to the back of the grid after his car overheated on the line and wouldn't start. He battled his way through the field, but a puncture finally ended his hopes and confirmed Häkkinen as the champion. The final championship of the 90s could and perhaps should have been Michael's first world title with Ferrari. The team did win the Constructors' Championship, but it was the other Ferrari driver, Eddie Irvine, who was to challenge for the title. Nobody seemed to want to win the 1999 World Championship. One by one, would-be champions came to the fore, only to be robbed or throw their title chances away. The year had looked like another straightforward battle between Michael Schumacher and Mika Häkkinen as the field entered the first lap of the British Grand Prix. But Schumacher crashed heavily while attempting to pass teammate Eddie Irvine, breaking his leg and ruling himself out for 3 months. Irvine took up the challenge of trying to score Ferrari's first driver's title in 2 decades. He won 4 races and scored points on 10 other occasions to give him the championship lead going into the season's last race in Japan. But Mika Häkkinen should have claimed a second successive world title long before the finale at Suzuka. His 11 pole positions were proof of his speed. He appeared to have a clear run at the title once Schumacher was sidelined. But after victories in Brazil, Spain and Canada, Häkkinen's progress was halted by a string of setbacks. A wheel fell off at Silverstone and he was spun out of the lead by teammate David Coulthard a week later in Austria. The bad luck continued at Hockenheim, where a puncture-induced crash at 190 miles an hour suddenly left him trailing Irvine in the points. But Häkkinen rallied to win in Hungary and, despite a costly spin at Monza, dominated the Japanese Grand Prix to retain the world title. Late on in that final race in Japan, Schumacher had the chance to win the title for his teammate by getting past Häkkinen, but an incredible defensive display from the reigning world champion earned him a well-won championship title. So it was that, despite being this historic behemoth in Formula 1, Ferrari would fail to win a Drivers' Championship for the second decade in a row. Instead, it was Williams and McLaren who wrote the history books in the 90s. Williams' dominance in the middle of the decade was thanks to some very intelligent technical innovation. 1992 saw the superior construction of the Williams-Renault FW14B achieve absolute dominance. The British team equipped the cars with an active chassis, an idea originating in the 80s and since perfected. Controlled by computer, the chassis adapted itself to the immediate driving conditions. Traction control, which automatically prevented unwanted wheel spin when accelerating, helped the car to victory. Nigel Mansell drove from victory to victory and had already achieved an unbeatable lead in the intermediate rankings after the Hungarian Grand Prix in August, 11 races into the 16-race season. He won 9 races, came second in 3 and retired from 4, as good as doubling the points tally of second-place finisher and his teammate Riccardo Patrese. It was at the Hungarian Grand Prix that year that new regulations came into force which affected the fuel of the Formula 1 cars. Aside from nitrogen and oxygen, both in limited quantities, the fuel was now only allowed to contain hydrocarbons. Alcohol, nitrogen compounds and other horsepower-friendly additives were disallowed. Only a year later, the fuel regulations were brought into force, which are still valid today. They dictated that the fuel had to comply with all the health and safety rules of the European Union. With that, the officials had finally opened the way for gas station petrol in Formula 1 racing. This was an early step in the sport's attempt to make the development being done on F1 cars more relevant to the cars in other motorsport categories and even road cars. No longer could F1 teams pump their cars full of Frankenstein fuel. They had to live off something far more similar to the petrol that comes out of the pump when you fill up. Perhaps the largest technical change in the 1990s, or at least the most noticeable one, came in 1998. The car width was reduced from 2 meters to 180 centimeters, and larger cockpits were stipulated for safety reasons. But the most important new paragraph in F1 technical history related to the tires. In place of the conventional treadless slicks, what was known as rib tread tires now came into use. 4 longitudinal grooves on the rear rubber tire and 3 on the front reduced surface contact with the tarmac. With this action, the FIA officials declared war on the dangerously high cornering speeds. From 1999, an additional front tire groove was intended to further increase the severity of this reduction. Those treaded tires attached to the nose of a red Ferrari would fill television screens for the next 5 years. There was more happening on the technical side of Formula 1 in the 90s though. One of the key areas of focus was car electronics, as teams explored the possibilities of advanced telemetry systems and data analysis to fine-tune their setups. Aerodynamics also played a pivotal role in shaping the performance of Formula 1 cars in the 1990s. The quest for optimal downforce and minimal drag led to the introduction of innovative design elements, such as high noses, winglets, and barge boards. Teams invested heavily in wind tunnel testing to refine their aerodynamic packages, aiming to find the perfect balance between speed and stability. The era also saw the widespread use of semi-automatic gearboxes, allowing drivers to shift gears without manually operating a clutch. This technology, pioneered by Ferrari and later adopted by other teams, contributed to quicker and more precise gear changes, enhancing overall performance on the track. It wasn't just performance that was seeing improvements in the 1990s though. The 80s had been the first decade in Formula 1 history when driver fatalities didn't reach double digits. The 1990s continued the trend of improved driver safety, with one decade-defining exception: the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix. While Michael Schumacher started to flex his muscles in the mid-90s, Ayrton Senna dominated the earlier seasons. He fought off Alain Prost in 1990, winning the title by 7 points, despite not finishing the last 3 races of the season. In 1991, he strolled to victory, his Honda-powered McLaren too powerful and his skills too great for anyone to challenge him. 1992 was much worse for the now legendary Brazilian driver. He retired from 7 of the 16 races as Nigel Mansell strolled to victory. 93 was closer, but again, race retirements would hurt Senna, as he failed to finish 5 Grand Prix to the 2 of his old rival Alain Prost. 1994 had started in much the same way. Senna failed to finish either of the opening 2 races of the season. In the season opener, he'd been pushing to try and pass Schumacher for the race lead late on, but spun out, ending his race. In Japan, he was rear-ended by Mika Hakkinen early in the race while in second position, ending his race very early again. With Schumacher winning both of the opening races, Senna already had a mountain to climb if he wanted to challenge for the world title. And going to Imola and the San Marino Grand Prix, he was determined to get points on the board. Expectations for the race were high, but it would devolve into what may be Formula 1's darkest ever weekend. In 2 separate incidents, one in qualifying and one in the race, Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna would die in crashes. However, the trouble started even before that. The weekend got off to a bad start when Rubens Barrichello had a major crash during practice and was knocked unconscious. Coming too fast into Variante Bassa, his car was launched into the air by the curb. Less than a yard from the curb was a tyre wall which almost instantly stopped his car's forward motion. His car was flipped over and landed upside down. Barrichello had swallowed his tongue and his life was only saved by the quick action from the medical team. He would be back at the circuit on the Saturday afternoon with a broken nose, bandaged arm, and cut lip. Though Barrichello has never been able to recall anything from the incident. That was just a sign of what was to come though. In qualifying, a front wing flap fell off Roland Ratzenberger's car, causing major suspension damage and worsened aerodynamics. On his next lap, the front wing broke off entirely and became lodged underneath the car, causing Ratzenberger to lose control and crash into the wall at the Villeneuve kink at over 180 miles an hour. His Simtek S941 was severely damaged, and he suffered a basal skull fracture caused by the impact and was pronounced dead at a hospital in Bologna shortly afterwards. After qualifying recommenced, Senna took pole ahead of Schumacher, Berger, Hill, Leto and Larini. During the race morning's driver meeting, all the drivers were talking about Ratzenberger's crash and were determined to improve safety for drivers, resulting in the inauguration of the Grand Prix Drivers Association. Senna offered to take the role of leader as he was the most senior driver. At the start of the race, JJ Leto's Benetton B194 stalled and was hit by Pedro Lami's Lotus. Debris from the crash, including Lami's right front tyre, flew into the grandstand and injured 4 spectators and a policeman. The race restarted from behind the safety car on lap 5. Then, at the start of lap 7, Senna lost control, for reasons that are still the subject of controversy, and his car went straight on at Tamburello into an unprotected concrete wall. At a trial after the crash, Italian prosecutors implicated the Williams team for a faulty steering column that broke and rendered the car unsteerable just seconds before the impact. But Senna's teammate, world champion Damon Hill, believed it was driver error that sent the vehicle off the road. Patrick Head and Adrian Newey could both have gone to jail for the apparent failure of the steering column, though Newey was later acquitted and the Italian statute of limitations saved Head from a homicide charge. In May 2011, Williams FW16 designer Adrian Newey expressed his views about the crash. The honest truth is that no one will ever know exactly what happened. Whether it was driver error, a steering failure, or a puncture as some thought, Senna left the track at 190 miles per hour, but was able to slow his car down by braking to 135 miles per hour in slightly under 2 seconds before hitting the wall. The suspension of his Williams broke on impact, the right front tyre flying backwards and hitting Senna on the head. The car slid to a halt on the circuit with Senna motionless. From the helicopter pictures, a slight movement of Senna's head gave a hint of hope, but after being airlifted to hospital, nothing could be done, and Senna was pronounced dead later that evening. After the race, a moving detail was revealed when an Austrian flag was found in the Brazilian's cockpit, because it is thought Senna had planned to pay tribute to Ratzenberger after the race. It is too simplistic to suggest Imola caused a radical rethink of safety measures. The sport was changing before the events of that awful weekend. Imola provided an unasked-for level of context. It focused minds and increased urgency, catalyzing a movement for change. Ratzenberger's death by basilar skull fracture was far too familiar at the time, claiming way too many victims in the latter years of the 20th century. It has now been all but eradicated by the widespread take-up of the HANS device. HANS, meaning head and neck support, traces its origins back to the 1980s, but its adoption and eventual obligatory status was pushed by a tragic series of high-profile fatalities. In F1, this process began after Ratzenberger's crash. Today, an elite racing driver wouldn't dream of getting into a car without a HANS device any more than they would drive without a helmet. There were also changes to the cars that year to help improve safety. 2 deaths and 1 near miss in one weekend was all the proof the sport's governing body needed that F1 cars had become too fast to be safe anymore. For round 5 of the season, the Spanish Grand Prix, the diffusers were shortened and there were changes to the front wing end plates to reduce front wing downforce. Then, holes in the airbox were opened to reduce engine power at the Canadian Grand Prix, race 6. At race number 9, the German Grand Prix, the plank was first fitted to the underside of a Formula 1 car, forcing teams to significantly raise the ride height of their cars. All of this was in aid of reducing the cornering speed of Formula 1 cars to levels that were deemed safe at the time. That season's agenda against cornering speed has continued right up to present-day Formula 1, and whenever there are new technical regulations introduced into the sport, limiting cornering speed is a top priority. As the decade came to a close, Formula 1 was a much safer place for drivers and spectators. The 90s had seen a number of different drivers and constructors fight for and win titles. But as Michael Schumacher's Ferrari team began to come together into an unstoppable force at the turn of the millennium, the age of unpredictability in Formula 1 would close. As the noughties began, the age of F1 dynasties dawned.
Oh, he's having a laugh. A 132.484. Mega Michael.
The early 2000s marked an era of unrelenting dominance for Ferrari and Michael Schumacher in Formula One. The success was a symphony of engineering brilliance, strategic masterstrokes, and Schumacher's unparalleled skill behind the wheel. The scarlet red Ferraris became synonymous with victory, and Schumacher, the Red Baron, was the undisputed king of the track. Ferrari had won the Constructors' Championship in 1999, which is where the big prize money is for the teams, but the public glory of the Drivers' Championship is what the fans really remember. At the turn of the millennium, Ferrari hadn't won a Drivers' Championship in over 2 decades. The two Ferrari drivers for the year 2000, Michael Schumacher and Rubens Barrichello, had been 10 and 7 years old respectively when Jody Scheckter won his Drivers' Championship title at Ferrari in 1979. The story of Ferrari's return to the pinnacle of Formula One and the beginning of Schumacher's dominance of the sport has a handful of main characters. The history books may just say Michael Schumacher, but an asterisk next to his name would take you to the likes of Ross Brawn, Rory Byrne, Paolo Martinelli, and the man that brought the whole gang together, Jean Todt. Ross Brawn, Rory Byrne, and Paolo Martinelli led Maranello's contemporary technical team. Ross as Direttore Tecnico, Rory head of vehicle planning, and Paolo the engine specialist. This trio had been recruited for Ferrari by Jean Todt through 1995 to 97. Martinelli first, followed by Brawn, then Byrne. The ex-Benetton engineers, whose cars had carried Michael Schumacher to his first 2 world titles in 1994 and 95. Through the seasons of 1997 to 99, Ross Brawn would consider Ferrari always to have been in catch-up mode, starting the opening race a half-second or more off the pace, most notably of McLaren, and relying upon Schumacher's skills to help compensate. Through 1999, its Ferrari F399 had taken the Constructors' title, but Schumacher's opening lap crash at Silverstone when his car's rear brakes failed and he broke a leg, missing the following 6 high summer races, foiled Ferrari's Drivers' Championship ambitions. Teammate Eddie Irvine stepped up late season, but Mika Hakkinen duly clinched the crown for McLaren Mercedes. In Drivers' Championship terms, Ferrari's breakthrough year then became 2000, the latest F2000 car winning first time out for Schumacher in the Australian Grand Prix, then completing a hat-trick with further consecutive wins in Brazil and at Imola, where Brawn's 2-stop strategy and a stunning drive by Michael brought Ferrari home soil victory. McLaren struck back with David Coulthard and Mika Hakkinen winning the British and Spanish GPs, before Michael responded on his home ground at the Nürburgring. Coulthard took Monaco, Schumacher's F1 2000 Canada. Coulthard and Hakkinen added McLaren wins in France, where Schumacher's engine ran a bearing, and Austria. Michael's teammate Rubens Barrichello scored his highly emotional breakthrough victory with his F1 2000 at Hockenheim, before Mika struck back with McLaren wins in Hungary and Belgium. Suddenly, Ferrari's season seemed to be unraveling, but it then exploded as every one of the final 4 Grand Prix fell to Schumacher's F1 2000, Italy, the USA, Japan, and Malaysia. He clinched the driver's title in the penultimate round, the constructors in the final. For Maranello's men, it was mission accomplished, an immense achievement after such a long and demoralizing wait. Concept and design on the Ferrari F1 2000 had begun in around March or April in 1999 after analysis of the contemporary F399's performance against its competitors' new cars, plus, of course, detailed evaluation of the coming year's new F1 regulations. The hunt for emissions and loopholes was on. As they say, F1 rules are read twice by the teams, once to see what they say, then once to see what they don't say. Targets were set to reduce structure weight so that as much ballast as possible could then be added as low as possible within the coming car, and which could then be placed to tune car balance and handling. Degradation rate of the Bridgestone tyres was closely studied to identify optimum wheel camber and toe stiffness. Ferrari's wind tunnel was working 3 shifts a day, seeking any and every advantage, since in recent years McLaren's aerodynamic performance had been considered superior. Paolo Martinelli's engine team did a phenomenal job with the engine that year. Ferrari's 049 V10 would rev up to 18,000 RPM and developed roughly 823 brake horsepower at 17,500 RPM. Both crankshaft speed and power output were new records for Maranello. This engine drove through a 7-speed semi-automatic sequential change longitudinal transaxle. Its lightweight carbon composite structure accepted suspension loads, while the titanium gear case beneath and to the rear also supported the rear wing and regulation impact structure. The work done throughout the season by Ferrari was phenomenal as well. In a time before budget caps, F1 teams could spend money to their heart's content, and the Scuderia made full use of that. The team had specific parts for absolutely every race. In Canada, they completely remounted their suspension just for that one track. Every track saw a different wing or barge board or brake drum, designed to find that extra 0.001% of performance at every race. Ferrari's test program included 125 days of development work against their main competitors McLaren's 77, some 19,610 miles of running against the Woking team's 14,358. But it wasn't just money at play. Ferrari's engineers were simultaneously pragmatic, evolutionary, cutting-edge, and immensely capable. Jean Todt's slick organization, combined with a talented combo of fellow boyhood aero modelers, Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne, plus Paolo Martinelli, meant that all that money that was available was well spent to find performance. Brawn's strategic nous, developed from his years of sports car endurance racing with TWR Jaguar, merged with Schumacher's outstanding class and Barrichello's fine supporting job to bring Ferrari back to what many saw as their historic home, the pinnacle of Formula One. That 2000 season was just a sign of what was to come though. With the marriage of Schumacher's incredible driving skills with one of the strongest technical teams the sport has ever seen, Ferrari were only just starting. The 2001 season witnessed a continuation of the Schumacher-Ferrari dominance. The German maestro secured his 4th championship, further solidifying his status as one of the greatest drivers in Formula One history. Ferrari's combination of raw power, aerodynamic efficiency, and strategic genius left their competitors trailing in their scarlet wake. In 2002, Ferrari unleashed the F2002, a masterpiece of engineering that would become one of the most successful Formula One cars of all time. Schumacher's brilliance was complemented by the technical excellence of the car, allowing him to secure his 5th championship with ease. Ferrari's dominance wasn't just limited to the Drivers' Championship. They also claimed the Constructors' title for the 4th consecutive year. The F2002 would win 15 of 17 races that season, almost matching the McLaren MP44's record of winning all but one race in 1988. The 2003 season saw another title for Schumacher and Ferrari. Despite facing stiff competition from rivals like Williams and McLaren, Schumacher's consistency and the sheer pace of the F2003 GA ensured that the championship trophy found its way back to Maranello. By this point, the combination of Schumacher, Brawn, and Byrne had become a formidable force that seemed unbeatable. As the 2004 season dawned, the anticipation of witnessing history being made was palpable. In 2003, Michael had matched Fangio's record of 4 consecutive World Drivers' Championships that the Argentine set between 1954 and 1957. The pre-season expectation was that Fangio's record would be broken, and Schumacher and Ferrari delivered in style, with the German securing his 7th World Championship, a record that many believed would stand the test of time. The F2004, an evolution of its predecessor, was the epitome of technical prowess, and it propelled Ferrari to another Constructors' title. Michael and Ferrari combined to establish the first of the 21st century's F1 dynasties. Together, they set the precedent for what success in Formula One looked like. As the century continued, more of these incredible team and driver combinations would crop up, but this was the one that set the standard. The problem was that the standard they were setting was too high. They'd taken the competitive excitement out of the sport with their incredible performances. Following on from Ferrari's utter domination in 2004, a rather strange rule was introduced for the 2005 season, as the FIA evaluated ways to shake things up. With the 2004 cars the fastest ever seen in F1 up to that point, some aerodynamic changes were introduced with the ostensible aim of slowing the cars a smidge. But one particular rule really caught the eye, that of banning tyre changes during a race and penalising anyone who did. The rule meant that drivers had to use one set of tyres to get through qualifying and the entirety of the Grand Prix. With the benefits of hindsight, it was a remarkably ridiculous rule with obvious safety concerns. An example being Kimi Raikkonen's suspension exploding on the final lap of the European Grand Prix after refusing to pit to change a flat-spotted tyre. But what the rule did do was completely put a halt on Ferrari's season and F1 dominance. While most of the front runners ran on the Michelin tyres, Ferrari were the only team from the front half of the grid to run the Bridgestone tyres. The Japanese manufacturer at the time was struggling to create a tyre with the same longevity or performance as the Michelin's. Ferrari would see out the season as distant spectators to the Renault versus McLaren title fight. with defending champion Michael Schumacher's sole win coming courtesy of the infamously disastrous United States Grand Prix, possibly Formula One's most embarrassing race ever. In fact, you could possibly go even further than that. The 2005 F1 US Grand Prix was one of the most bizarre open-wheel races in the history of motorsports. In that season, there were 10 teams competing against each other. That means 20 cars. However, only 3 of those teams were allowed to race at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The reason for that is both mind-boggling and intriguing. In 2005, there were 2 manufacturers that provided tyres to F1 teams, Bridgestone and Michelin. Each F1 team was meant to choose their tyre manufacturer and stick with them for the rest of the season. Unfortunately, Michelin tyres were unable to handle the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. When the teams took part in the free practice sessions, several teams using Michelin tyres encountered issues. Ralf Schumacher, who was in Toyota at the time, encountered a horrendous crash because the left rear tyre of his car failed. Michelin later discovered that turn 13 of the track, the infamous banking curve, was putting unusually high amounts of pressure on the tyres, causing them to fail. Although they ordered another set of tyres with different specifications from the Clermont-Ferrand headquarters, those new tyres were also failing. After figuring out the issue, Michelin representatives Pierre de Pasquerie and Nick Schorrock sent a letter to FIA race director Charlie Whiting regarding possible solutions. They mentioned how the cars could not run more than 10 laps if they did not slow down in turn 13. Furthermore, they also suggested adding a chicane on the turn to decrease the load on the tyres and allow the other 7 teams to race. However, the FIA refused to make any of these changes and was surprised that Michelin had not prepared their tyres according to the track. Whiting mentioned in his response that adding a chicane right before a race is simply not possible and wouldn't be fair to the teams using Bridgestone tyres. Eventually, all team principals decided that the teams using Michelin tyres could do the formation lap but not participate in the race. That left Ferrari, Jordan Toyota, and Minardi to race against each other. Michael Schumacher won the race while his teammate Rubens Barrichello came in second. With Ferrari toppled from the top after 5 consecutive titles, and Formula One's most embarrassing moment ever a consequence of the decisions made to make that happen, the rule stopping tyres from being changed was removed for 2006. Ferrari and Michael would return as strong competitors for 2006, but there was another driver who was already taking centre stage in Formula One. With Ferrari out of the way in 2005 thanks to the controversial tyre rule, there was a chance for another young driver to explode to the fore of Formula One. Driving for the Renault team, a young Spaniard called Fernando Alonso showcased a combination of raw speed, tactical acumen, and maturity beyond his years throughout the 2005 season. The championship battle that year was intense, with the likes of Kimi Raikkonen and McLaren Mercedes pushing hard. However, Alonso's consistency and ability to deliver under pressure saw him take the title with 2 races to spare. The Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos was a setting for Alonso's historic achievement. While the race was won by McLaren's Juan Pablo Montoya, Alonso's 3rd place finish was enough to secure the championship. As he crossed the finish line, the weight of his accomplishment was evident. The young Spaniard had not only broken Emerson Fittipaldi's 32-year-old record to become the youngest world champion, but he'd also ended the dominance of Michael Schumacher and Ferrari, who had won 5 consecutive titles from 2000 to 2004. Alonso's victory marked a significant moment for Spain, a country that, up until then, had not enjoyed significant success in Formula One. Alonso's championship win ignited a passion for F1 in Spain, leading to an increase in viewership, the establishment of the Spanish Grand Prix as a staple on the F1 calendar, and inspiring a new generation of Spanish drivers. In the years that followed, Alonso would go on to win another world championship in 2006 and establish himself as one of the sport's all-time greats. His battles with contemporaries like Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel and Jenson Button have become legendary, and his tenacity and skill behind the wheel have earned him fans worldwide. However, as with all records in the ever-evolving world of Formula One, Alonso's distinction as the youngest world champion was eventually surpassed, sooner rather than later. First, it was Lewis Hamilton in 2008, and then Sebastian Vettel in 2010, who clinched the title at the tender age of 23. Alonso's championship wins in 05 and 06 would be followed by an incredible season that saw a 3-way title battle go right down to the final race of the season. 2007 was the year of the painful Spygate affair, and the best prepared and most impressive rookie in Formula One history so far. But 2007 was also the year that Kimi Räikkönen finally translated undoubted natural speed into World Championship success. The much-loved Finnish driver, who would go on to be known as the Iceman, replaced Michael Schumacher at Ferrari. Schumacher had retired at the end of 2006, stating that he simply didn't want to commit the required time to Formula One anymore, as he had other priorities in his life. Fortunately for Ferrari, Kimi immediately started where Schumacher had finished off, winning the Australian Grand Prix on his debut for the team. 3 further victories followed, but he entered the last 2 races of the season 17 points behind McLaren rookie Lewis Hamilton, with just 20 points available. Fernando Alonso, driving alongside Lewis at McLaren for a single season, still was right in the mix as well, pushing both drivers to the end. That final race in 2007 marked the first time since 1986 that 3 drivers had a chance of becoming world champion at the season finale, and the first time since the inaugural season in 1950 that the man who stood in third before the final race went on to win the championship. That driver in 1950 being Giuseppe Farina. Hamilton was the favourite with 107 points, followed by Alonso with 103 points, and Räikkönen with 100 points. Hamilton started second but dropped to the back of the pack after a gearbox problem. He recovered to 7th, but Räikkönen won the race and the championship. The final standings were Räikkönen with 110 points, followed by Hamilton and Alonso each with 109 points. Räikkönen's late charge, following worse luck at the start of the season, would narrowly give him the World Drivers' Championship. With Hamilton and Alonso level on points, their positions were determined by countback. Each driver had won 4 races, but Hamilton had 5 second-place finishes to Alonso's 4, so he was awarded second place in the championship with Alonso third. The conspiracy theories about how Hamilton lost that title in his rookie season persist to this day, but the young sensation from Britain would come back stronger the following year. Formula One in the noughties will forever be remembered for its scandals. From the pit stop and tyre madness of 05, to Spygate and the theories of outside influence in Hamilton's failure to win the title in 07, to Crashgate in 08, to the double diffuser and the potential splitting of the series in 2009. It was a decade that tarnished Formula One forever. However, in 2008, the sport did have something to celebrate. In 2008, Alonso moved back to Renault after a singular fractious season with McLaren, and despite 2 early wins, Räikkönen had been unable to replicate his championship-winning form. That left Hamilton and Ferrari's Felipe Massa to fight it out for the title, but both squandered big opportunities that year. Massa retired from the lead on the final lap of round 11 at the Hungarian Grand Prix with car trouble and drove away from a pit stop in Singapore with a fuel hose still attached to his car. He went on to finish 5th there while Hamilton was 3rd. At the following race in Japan, a wildly aggressive start from pole saw Hamilton tangle with Räikkönen. Hamilton would finish down the order with Massa 5th, although he made amends at the penultimate race by leading Massa home from pole. That meant Hamilton returned to Interlagos, the scene of the failure of his 07 title attempt, with a 5-point lead over Massa. Points were awarded at the time to the top 8 finishers in the order of 10, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. To become F1's youngest champion, a 5th place finish was all Hamilton needed. On race day, Massa was on pole position. Hamilton had qualified 4th ahead of McLaren teammate Heikki Kovalainen. McLaren was confident it had the pace to stay inside the top 5, but the grey skies above the circuit promised an unpredictable contest was in store. As the start approached, the rain started to fall, delaying lights out. Hamilton acclaimed superb victories in similar conditions at Monaco and Great Britain that year, while Massa had struggled to master the rain. Hamilton's excellence in the wet had always been a feature for drivers whose youth career had been spent in England, where a rainy race day is always likely. Massa led away cleanly, and Hamilton avoided any drama at the start. An early safety car was deployed for another crash, and the rain soon eased off. Everyone switched to the dry tyre, but Hamilton was one of the last to do so, briefly relegating him to 6th position behind Giancarlo Fisichella. For most of the race, the championship battle was finely poised. Massa led comfortably out in front, while Hamilton switched between 4th and 5th position, both enough for his first championship. All the while, dark clouds lingered around the Interlagos circuit. There would be another rainstorm before the checkered flag fell. Light rain started to fall on lap 63 of 71. Hamilton, running fourth, pitted 2 laps later for the intermediate wet weather tyre, as did the man directly behind him, Toro Rosso's Sebastian Vettel. Massa made the same stop the following lap. While most took that same option, 2 cars had crucially opted to go with a different strategy to the rest. Toyota had left Timo Glock and Jarno Trulli out on the dry tyre, banking on the rain staying light enough for them to go to the finish without the time lost in a pit stop. The decision elevated Glock from 7th to 4th, meaning Hamilton was now in 5th, with Vettel's charging Toro Rosso right behind him. The battle for 5th had now become one which could decide the entire championship. Hamilton, stalked closer and closer by Vettel, suddenly gets unlapped by the BMW of Robert Kubica on the inside of the circuit's final corner, Wankel. The spooked McLaren driver then made a crucial mistake, running wide, allowing Vettel past him. Suddenly, Hamilton was in 6th position with just 3 laps to go. Hamilton spent the next 2 laps trying to catch and pass Vettel to move back into the position he needed for the World Championship. At the end of the penultimate lap, Timo Glock, who had stayed out on dry tyres as the rain began, was going significantly slower than the chasing Vettel and Hamilton. With just 1 lap left, Vettel in 5th and Hamilton in 6th were 15 seconds behind the 4th place Glock. Out in front, Massa completed the most perfect race of his life, waving his finger in the air as the home crowd roared him across the finish line for the last time. Hamilton would not take the checkered flag for another 39 seconds. As things stood at that moment, Massa was the world champion, Brazil's first since Ayrton Senna in 1991. Hamilton, still chasing Vettel, tried one last lunge on the Toro Rosso driver midway round the final lap, but was still unable to get close enough to pass the young German. While most were oblivious to anything but Felipe Massa and the celebrating Ferrari garage, Martin Brundle, commentating on the English-language world feed, was paying close attention to the battle for 5th and Lewis Hamilton. As the camera switched to the angle looking down at the Wankel corner, where Hamilton had made his mistake several laps earlier, it showed Vettel and the McLaren driver moving off the racing line to pass a slow-moving, red and white Toyota. Hamilton was now in 5th position. Brundle stuttered, his voice rising with excitement to deliver his most famous call. Is that Glock? Is that Glock going slowly? That's Glock! The dramatic finish had yet to be realised in the pit lane. Cameras showed Massa's family celebrating with Ferrari mechanics, while Hamilton's brother Nicholas and girlfriend, pop star Nicole Scherzinger, celebrated with McLaren mechanics. The bad news quickly filtered around the Ferrari garage and the Interlagos circuit. Never has a driver looked so upset to be standing on the top step of an F1 podium as Felipe Massa was at the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix. He may have won his home race, but he had lost the title in front of his adoring fans. Lewis Hamilton, though, had enjoyed his first taste of victory, one of many which was to come. After the excitement of some of the closest ever Formula 1 seasons, it's hard to believe that the Naughties saved the most astonishing season of the decade for the very end. After everything that had come before it, Schumacher's dominance, the Spanish upstart Alonso, the 3-way title battle in 07, the last lap drama of 08, it is perhaps the story of Brawn GP in 2009 that is the most incredible. The season that saw the Formula 1 hierarchy brought to its knees by a privateer team working on pennies found down the side of couch cushions was called the greatest story in sporting history by many. From the ashes of the Honda F1 team that was sold to Ross Brawn for £1 British amidst the global financial crisis, rose a team that had a car with hundreds of millions of pounds of research invested into it, but nothing to be spent on it throughout the season. The team just had a chassis that had been designed with Honda's money before they sold the team, but they had no power unit until Mercedes, with the help of then McLaren team boss Martin Whitmarsh, came to the rescue. The story from then on is part of Formula 1 lore, the radical car dropping jaws across the paddock with its speed when it belatedly hit the track in testing with a loophole-busting double diffuser. Despite a bare budget, whittled down staff and scarcely enough spares to get through the opening races, Brawn wrote one of the sport's greatest stories of triumph in adversity. Jenson Button, driving a car that was held together by electrical tape and prayers by the end of the season, would win the Drivers' Championship that year, doing just enough to hold off the chasing Red Bull of Sebastian Vettel. In 2010, Mercedes bought the team, and with the foundation laid out by Ross Brawn, went on to win 8 F1 Constructors titles in a row from 2014 to 2021, and take Lewis Hamilton to 6 of his 7 F1 crowns. The story of Brawn GP was immortalized in the 2023 4-hour-long documentary series Brawn: The Impossible Formula One Story, narrated by Keanu Reeves. While the Naughties played host to some of the most well-remembered seasons in Formula One history, there was a lot happening off the track as well. Formula One underwent a significant transformation in terms of its global footprint. The sport, once concentrated in Europe, expanded its horizons, venturing into new territories and reaching out to diverse markets. The 2000s witnessed the introduction of several new races, each adding a unique flavor to the Formula One calendar. In 2004, the Bahrain Grand Prix made its debut, marking the first race in the Middle East. The state-of-the-art Bahrain International Circuit provided a stark contrast to the traditional European tracks, featuring wide runoff areas and modern facilities. In 2008, Singapore joined the Formula One circus with its iconic night race. The Marina Bay Circuit, winding through the heart of the city-state, became a dazzling spectacle, combining the allure of urban racing with the vibrant backdrop of Singapore's skyline. The night race concept added a new dimension to the sport, creating a captivating visual spectacle that captivated audiences worldwide. The following year, Abu Dhabi joined the ranks with the Yas Marina circuit. The track, renowned for its twilight race, featured an extravagant pit lane exit that passed underneath a hotel. The inaugural Abu Dhabi Grand Prix in 2009 provided a fitting finale to the season, adding a touch of glamour to the championship showdown. Formula One's foray into Asia continued with the introduction of the Korean Grand Prix in 2010. The Korean International Circuit, located in Yeongnam, offered a challenging layout with a mix of high-speed straights and technical corners. While the race faced logistical challenges and uncertainties, it marked Formula One's commitment to tapping into the vast Asian market. The expansion into the new territories wasn't limited to the race calendar. Formula One also embraced the digital age, leveraging technology to reach a global audience. Social media platforms became a powerful tool for teams, drivers, and the sport itself to engage with fans across the world. The rise of online streaming and digital content transformed how fans consumed Formula One, breaking down geographical barriers and bringing the sport to new audiences. Amidst the backdrop of an ever-growing fan base, the continued dominance of certain teams, and the emergence of new talents, Formula One grappled with the ever-evolving landscape of technology and team strategies. The FIA responded with a series of rule changes aimed at balancing competition, improving safety, and enhancing the overall spectacle. The 2009 ban on extensive in-season testing shifted the emphasis to simulator work and wind tunnel testing. The teams had to maximize their resources and adapt quickly to rule changes without the luxury of extensive on-track testing. This challenge leveled the playing field somewhat, giving smaller teams with limited budgets a better chance to compete against their more financially endowed rivals. While the decade was undoubtedly one of F1's best, it was also almost its last. While the testing changes to help level the playing field were accepted by the F1 teams, a budget cap that was proposed in 2009 by FIA President Max Mosley drove the Formula One teams to attempt to make their own series. F1 has always been about teams protecting their own interests, and the biggest example of this was during 2009, when 8 teams nearly walked away from F1 to start their own series. They went as far as making an official announcement and even drafting a provisional calendar, saying there was no way they'd be back in F1. To understand this fight, you need to understand the situation F1 was in at the time. There were essentially 2 key players, the FIA and FOTA. The FIA, as today, is the governing body of F1 and other motorsport series around the world. They make the rules and make sure they're followed at every race. FOTA is the F1 Teams Association. They were a formal alliance between the teams that represented their interests in negotiations. It made more sense to have one combined voice than 10 voices from 10 teams. The FIA created the rules, and FOTA followed them in the championship. Max Mosley, the FIA president at the time, had been a team owner in the 70s and had taken over as president in the early 90s to give a more sympathetic approach to the teams who had always been fighting with the FIA. Max decided to bring in a budget cap to make F1 more sustainable for the future after the 2008 financial crash. He knew that imposing a budget cap was going to be rough going, with money burning being something F1 teams love. so Max tried to be cunning. The rules announced for 2010 were that there would be an optional budget cap, so you could choose to do it. Obviously, without some kind of incentive, no F1 team in their right mind would take the choice to limit the amount of money they were allowed to spend. Opting into the budget cap came with a massive bonus. Teams who accepted the budget cap would have much more technical and design freedom, so they could feasibly build a better car but with less money. That budget cap was just $30 million, which is about $43 million in modern money, and obviously far less than the modern F1 budget cap, which is comfortably over $100 million. FOTA were not happy with this. They were being entered into a competition that basically had two different sets of rules. Those who adhered to the budget cap would have the freedom of development to be a proper F1 team, and those that didn't would be limited into what was basically an F1.5 team. All 10 teams met up at the Monaco Grand Prix for an emergency meeting and unanimously agreed to withdraw by the end of the season unless the rules were changed. FOTA rightly thought that without teams, the FIA couldn't have Formula 1. FOTA might not have been allowed to call their new series Formula 1, but when those teams race together, that is basically what it would be. In the days that followed though, the teams started to switch sides. 3 days after that meeting in Monaco, Williams committed to Formula 1. Then Force India followed suit. The remaining 8 members of FOTA eventually agreed to rejoin the FIA's Formula 1 series, not before months of back and forth though, which included the releasing of a race schedule for the new breakaway series that included F1's crown jewel, the Monaco Grand Prix. The teams agreed to rejoin on the condition that Max Mosley would not stand for re-election as the FIA president. They did agree to some cost-saving measures, such as bans to in-season testing and to completely close down their factories during the summer break, but it was nowhere near the level of Max's original plans. The Formula 1 teams had defeated Mosley, and the sport was saved. In 2010, everyone turned up to go racing just as had been planned, everything back to normal. Except, it wasn't business as usual. One noisy energy drink company was about to upset the Formula 1 hierarchy in a big way.
The World Championship record is equalled. Lewis Hamilton wins the Turkish Grand Prix and is a 7-time champion of the world.
While the second decade of the 21st century would herald the start of Formula 1's hybrid era, there was a lot going on in the years that preceded the sport's biggest ever rule change. After the potential end of Formula 1 in 2009, the FIA announced its intention to open up the grid, aiming for a total of 13 teams, and in July 2009 selected 3 new teams from 15 new applicants, as well as confirming the entry of all 10 existing teams. The existing F1 teams, under the FOTA organization, agreed a system of technical support to assist new teams. This compromise proposal would involve the supplier parts and design knowledge to the new entrants, but not full customer cars, in return for which the budget cap idea was dropped. The 3 teams on the entry list released in July 2009 included Campos Meta, a Spanish team led by former driver and GP2 team owner Adrian Campos, and Madrid-based sports advertising agency Meta Image, Mana Grand Prix, an F3 team run by John Booth, and designer Nick Worth, who was formerly involved in the Simtech Ford team who competed in 1994 and 1995, and US F1, a team created by former designer Ken Anderson and journalist Peter Windsor. Following the withdrawal of BMW Sauber, Lotus Racing was accepted to return to the grid for the first time since the 1994 Australian Grand Prix. Mana became known as Virgin Racing after Richard Branson's Virgin Group purchased naming rights to the team, while Campos Meta was reimagined as Hispania Racing, or HRT, after investor Jose Ramon Carabante purchased the team from Adrian Campos shortly before the first race of the season. Unfortunately, starting a Formula 1 team, never mind a competitive one, is no easy feat. US F1 officially withdrew from the championship in early March before the first race of the season, following months of speculation and accusations from whistleblowers that the team had been crippled by mismanagement for months. The remaining new teams, Lotus, Virgin, and HRT, were often more than 3 seconds per lap slower than the established teams. After fighting reliability issues early in the season, the 3 teams soon established themselves, with Lotus leading the way, their best result being a 12th place for Heikki Kovalainen in Japan. Virgin struggled after discovering their fuel tank was too small, forcing them to push their development schedule back 5 races in order to build a car that could actually finish a race. HRT were the slowest of the 3 and by mid-season were rotating their drivers on a regular basis, but a pair of 14th places for Karen Chandhok in Australia and Monaco put the team ahead of Virgin in the Constructors' Championship for most of the season. While the other teams did manage to make it to a full season of Formula 1, it wouldn't be long before more would follow the way of US F1. The problem was that all the new teams had committed to F1 under the impression that the budget cap would be in place, but without it, the level of spending required to be competitive and therefore entice sponsors to fund the team was just far too high. HRT was the first to hit the wall after just 3 years. Bruno Senna and Karen Chandhok looked on in the Bahrain pits while the team scrambled to complete the Dallara-designed F110 chassis for their first appearance in 2010. A year of toil at the back followed, and the team chopped and changed drivers as it searched for a budget. They sank to last in 2012, and the team was put up for sale before the final race, where drivers Pedro de la Rosa and Narain Karthikeyan took the checkered flag 17th and 18th respectively, each 2 laps down. Lotus was arguably the strongest proposition as a new team and carried the name of a former legendary F1 entry. The Lotus team name was made famous by Colin Chapman's title-winning squad, whose F1 team closed 16 years earlier. It may not have lived up to that formidable reputation, but it did draw several recruits from Toyota's recently shuttered team, not least driver Jarno Trulli, who was partnered up with ex-McLaren pilot Heikki Kovalainen. They won the battle for new team honours in 2010 and the useful 10th place in the Constructors' Championship, which promised a slice of the valuable prize fund. Lotus repeated the trick in 2011 and again the following year, by which time they'd rebranded to another British sports car brand, Caterham. But after slipping out of the top 10 over the following 2 seasons, the team hit financial trouble. After disappearing from the grid following the 2014 Russian Grand Prix, the team made a surprise return for the Abu Dhabi finale, aided by a crowdfunding campaign spearheaded by the administrators. It wasn't enough to secure their return in 2015, however. In 2011, the final of the 3 new teams, Virgin, was rebranded by Russian supercar brand Marussia, and finally scored its first points in its 5th season. After switching from Ford Cosworth power to Ferrari, Jules Bianchi finished 8th in Monaco, was demoted to 9th by a post-race penalty, but nonetheless claimed 2 points. Cruelly, less than 5 months later, Bianchi suffered serious injuries in a crash during the Japanese Grand Prix, from which he died the following year. It was the second serious crash the team experienced during its brief existence. Maria De Villota lost an eye when she struck a vehicle during a testing run at Duckford Aerodrome in 2012. She died the following year. Marussia was on its last legs at the time of Bianchi's crash and did not reappear that year following the next round in Russia. The team went into receivership but was rescued and re-entered in 2015 as Manor. A more promising 2016 campaign included another point, courtesy of Pascal Wehrlein in Austria, and until the penultimate round they were still in with a chance of beating Sauber to 10th, but they lost the position and the vital prize money it would have bought, and finally collapsed during the off-season. Jules Bianchi's death would be the only one of an F1 driver during a race in the 21st century, and to this day is the last death of an F1 driver during a competition. After 20 years of driver safety improvements, seeing a driver die on track was a shock to the entire Formula 1 community and to the wider world. Jules had been seen as Ferrari's driver for the future, a great young talent whose career had been closely followed by those in the sport. Bianchi came from a family of racers, including his uncle Lucien, who won the 1968 Le Mans 24-hour with Pedro Rodriguez and made 17 Grand Prix starts, and grandfather Mauro, who was a successful GT racer. In his second season in F3, he comfortably took the championship with 8 wins, and it was after that season that Ferrari took him on as a junior driver. Jules would get his first Formula 1 start after a vacancy opened up at Marussia when Luis Razia's sponsorship package failed to materialize. He was quickly confirmed as the team's second driver for 2013 alongside fellow Formula 1 debutant Max Chilton. Bianchi settled in quickly and gave the team their most important result of the year in his second appearance for them. 13th at Sepang was their best result of the season, and it eventually netted them a valuable 10th in the Constructors' Championship. Bianchi was retained by Marussia for 2014 and continued to perform occasional tests for Ferrari, who also became his team's engine suppliers. In Monaco that year, the team achieved a breakthrough when Bianchi scored their first points at Monaco. Later in the season though, at a wet Japanese Grand Prix, a tragedy occurred. Bianchi slid off the track during a caution flag period, and at high speed, ran under a crane vehicle that was removing another car from the track after an accident. The accident led to serious brain damage. Bianchi never regained consciousness. After weeks in a hospital in Japan, Bianchi was transported back to his native France to a hospital in Nice. 9 months after the crash, he would die in hospital of the injuries he sustained. Like in 1994, following the deaths at the San Marino Grand Prix, Jules' death brought wide-ranging safety improvements to Formula One. The FIA confirmed ongoing research into closed cockpits for Formula One cars, the possibility of fitting protective skirting to all recovery vehicles, as well as ways to slow down cars in crash zones more effectively than double yellow flags. With respect to the latter, the FIA moved to quickly consider the introduction of a virtual safety car, or VSC system, which was then tested during the season's final 3 Grand Prix in the United States, Brazil, and Abu Dhabi. A report was produced by an FIA panel made up of former drivers and team principals to look into the cause of the accident. The report found that there was no single cause of Bianchi's accident. Instead, the contributing factors were found to include track conditions, car speed, and the presence of a recovery vehicle on the circuit. The report also made several suggestions to improve safety when recovering stricken vehicles, before concluding that it would not have been possible to mitigate Bianchi's injuries through changes to the cockpit design. The report also revealed that Bianchi pressed both the throttle and brake, which should shut off power to the engine. However, Mauritius's uniquely designed brake-by-wire system was found to be incompatible with the fail-safe, so the engine was not shut off. Despite this, Mauritius was not found to be responsible for the accident. Perhaps the biggest change to safety that came from Jules Bianchi's death was the push to begin the development of the Halo system. The device was made up of a metal bar attached to the front of the cockpit, which supports a metal ring that sits above the driver's head and is connected to the rear of the cockpit. The device is designed to stop a driver's helmet from coming into contact with anything during a crash. It also deflects any large debris, which can be deadly at Formula One speeds. The system was met with stiff opposition originally, with Niki Lauda claiming that the system distorted the essence of racing cars. The system was also initially unpopular with fans, with some saying that it was visually unappealing, against the concept of open cockpit racing, and obstructed the driver's vision. There were more pessimistic comments from many other race teams such as Ferrari, Mercedes, and the drivers thinking the invention would make it harder for the driver to get out of the car. Though other former drivers, including Jackie Stewart, welcomed the system and compared it to the introduction of seatbelts, which had been similarly criticized, but then became the norm also on road cars. Max Verstappen made a scathing assessment of the Halo in 2018, saying that it abused the DNA of F1, which was less dangerous than riding a bicycle in a city. Despite the initial pushback against the design though, it was quickly widely accepted and praised. Every season, it saves drivers from serious accidents or worse, death. In 2021, it saved Lewis Hamilton from injury after his Mercedes became lodged under Max Verstappen's Red Bull at Imola. When Joe Guan Yu found himself upside down and sliding into the gravel pit on the run to Turn 1 at the 2022 Silverstone Grand Prix, the Halo undoubtedly saved his life before his car flipped over the tyre barrier and into the catch net on the other side. Perhaps the most famous case of a driver being saved by the Halo device though was that of Romain Grosjean at the 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix. Following a head-on crash with a barrier at the circuit, his Haas car split in half as the survival cell and front of his car broke through the barrier, with the metal barrier being forced over his head by the Halo device. As his car burst into flame, Romain was miraculously able to pull himself out of the burning wreck of his car, with nothing worse than some burn injuries to his hands. Formula One continues to try and improve safety in any way it can, and the death of Jules Bianchi will always remain as a stark reminder that F1 can never take safety for granted. While the first few years of the 2010s were notable for failing teams and that tragic accident, it was Red Bull that took most of the headlines. In 2009, Red Bull pushed Brawn GP all the way to the end of the season, and had there been a few more races on the calendar that year, they would have won the championship as a young Sebastian Vettel showed what an incredible driver he could be. In 2010 though, with no team turning up to the pre-season practice with some secret tech that made them seconds faster than everyone else, Red Bull were ready to take over. All new regulations for 2009 attempted to limit downforce. This big regulation change allowed Red Bull's design guru, Adrian Newey, the opportunity to fundamentally re-evaluate, wiping away the accumulated advantages of the bigger Ferrari and McLaren teams. Newey reintroduced a feature not seen in F1 for years: pull rod activation of the rear suspension. This moved the suspension rockers from the top to the bottom, exploiting more fully the space available for the newly restricted diffuser. It allowed the gearbox to be lowered and exposed the upper wishbone, which could be given an aerodynamic profile that linked to the beam wing. The Coke bottle profile of the lower bodywork widened out at the top like a fishtail, manipulating air pressure to accelerate the airflow over the top of the diffuser, causing it to work harder. The nose was high at its tip, creating a big volume beneath to feed the underfloor. Red Bull had installed the double diffuser, which they initially missed in the new regulations midway through 2009, and the 2010 car was all about optimizing the revolutionary part. The RB6, as the 2010 Red Bull was called, was aerodynamically superior to the entire rest of the grid, and in Sebastian Vettel, they had a driver who was eager to make the most of it. Not that it would be easy for him. 2010 was exceptional for a few reasons. Not only was the championship decided on the last race of the season in Abu Dhabi, but 4 drivers headed to Yas Marina circuit with a genuine shot at the title, a first in Formula 1. Formula 1 bosses had decided on a new point system for the season, with the top 10 awarded 25, 18, 15, 12, 10, 8, 6, 4, 2 and 1 points respectively. The idea was that a 7-point gap between first and second place would promote a race-to-win strategy, instead of the previous system where podium finishes were enough to secure the Drivers' Championship. It certainly turned out so. Heading into the final race of 2010, Ferrari's Fernando Alonso was leading the Drivers' Championship with 246 points. Red Bull drivers Mark Webber and Sebastian Vettel were second and third, on 238 and 231 points. McLaren's Lewis Hamilton, on 222, was also in contention with 25 points available for the winner, but required some miracles to happen on track to actually claim the championship. At the start of the race, Button passed Alonso, relegating the 29-year-old to 4th, and with Vettel leading the race, that was the lowest possible position Alonso could win the title from. From his 5th place, Webber was the first of the leaders to take on fresh rubber after complaining of his rear tyres falling away. Ferrari countered by bringing in Felipe Massa, who'd been directly behind the Australian at the time, but he failed to slingshot by as had been hoped. That forced Ferrari to bring in Alonso to counter Webber, leading to the 29-year-old dropping behind a gaggle of cars, but primarily Rosberg and Petrov. At that stage, Alonso would have believed in his car and his talent being supreme enough to force his way past both as the race unfolded, but it was not to be. He tried time and again to get past Petrov, and in his desperation almost lost his front wing, but nothing he could do could get him the pass he so desperately needed. With 7 laps to run, Vettel led Hamilton, Button, Rosberg, Kubica, Petrov, and with Alonso 7th and Webber out of the running in 8th, the title would belong to the young Red Bull driver. Those last 7 laps will likely have been the most nerve-wracking of Vettel's life, but he mastered them with confidence to eventually take his place in F1 folklore. At 23 years and 135 days, Vettel beat the record of Lewis Hamilton for the youngest ever F1 champion by 166 days. From there, Sebastian and Red Bull would win every title until the next big technical regulation change came in 2014. This was the second of the modern F1 dynasties. Between driver and team, Vettel and Red Bull were able to get ahead and then stay ahead of the competition. And that would have likely continued if it weren't for the beginning of the turbo hybrid era and the emergence of Formula 1's third dynasty. 2014 ushered in the most significant rule changes in F1 history, with normally aspirated 2.4-litre V8 engines replaced by new 1.6-litre turbocharged V6 power units, no longer officially called engines, integrated with complex hybrid energy recovery systems, or ERS, that the FIA claimed gave the sport a much cleaner and greener image, more relevant to developing road car technologies. Teams now had to complete races on 100 kilograms of fuel, around 30% less than in 2013, with a limit on fuel flow per minute, and drivers allowed only 5 rather than 8 engines for the entire season. Blown diffusers, which had been a controversial performance differentiator for Red Bull in previous seasons, were banned. The result was slow, unreliable, and uncharacteristically quiet F1 cars. Bernie Ecclestone, head of F1 at the time and a long-time critic of the pending switch to the new generation engines, was horrified by the softness at the season-opening GP in Australia, vowing to find a way of making them sound like racing cars. But while the reintroduction of titanium skid plates and the sparks that come with them would help a bit in 2015, the racing consequence of the new engines in their freshman year was that Red Bull and Ferrari had a huge horsepower disadvantage to Mercedes, from which neither team could recover. No one, not Renault, not Ferrari, not even Honda, ever figured out how to match the Germans for speed and efficiency under the new constraints. The Mercedes boss and part owner Toto Wolff would later say that the Mercedes team had to run their engine at a suboptimal level to lower the power output, because if they'd used their 2014 engine at its full power, they were sure the FIA would have stepped in to ban the parts that were giving them such a massive advantage, specifically the split turbo. That 2014 season was only a battle between the two Mercedes drivers, Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, with the two of them only failing to win twice. Apart from the 5 retirements between them, they only failed to have both cars on the podium twice, once in Hungary and once in Abu Dhabi. The rest of the field weren't even close to being competitive, with the Mercedes cars regularly finishing over 20 seconds ahead of their closest competitor. Nonetheless, the World Championship would not be decided until the final race of the season. This was mostly due to the Mercedes team, under Toto Wolff's leadership, letting their drivers battle each other throughout the season. As the cars lined up for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, the final race of that season, Lewis Hamilton led Nico Rosberg by 17 points, but with double points on offer at the final race of the season, one of the stupidest rules ever introduced in Formula 1, all was to play for. Rosberg had pole position with Hamilton in second, but an incredible launch from Lewis gave him the lead into turn 1, and from there, the race and title was decided. A loss of electrical power in his engine would leave Rosberg unable to do anything, and eventually, the German would finish the race in 14th, out of the points and out of the fight for the World Championship. 2015 would follow a similar story, with Mercedes utterly dominating and Hamilton taking a well-fought victory over his teammate in the Drivers' Championship. But in 2016, things didn't quite go the Brits' way. If it wasn't for the rivalry between Hamilton and Rosberg, the early years of the turbo hybrid era would likely have been some of the most boring in the sport's history, but their ever-fracturing relationship led to some excellent on-track battles, and in 2016, the never-ending fight for supremacy within the team really came to a head. While in the previous 2 seasons, Rosberg had never quite looked to be the match for Hamilton, 2016 started off very differently. Nico Rosberg proved that this could be his breakthrough F1 season, when he got off to a breakneck start, winning the opening 4 races handsomely. Nico stepped up his game, doubling down on fitness, with 1 kilogram of driver body weight equating to 1/10 of a second per lap, upping his simulator work and race discipline, and used those twin seasons losing to Hamilton to fuel his motivation. Rosberg dedicated his being to reaching the pinnacle of motorsport. He would later say that after seeing the work Hamilton put in away from the track, he knew he had to focus on every single aspect of his game to battle the reigning Drivers' Champion over the whole season. Staring at a huge 43-point deficit, Lewis Hamilton fought back. Spain saw one of the dramatic highlights of the season, when the duo took their aggression to the next level and collided on track, retiring both Mercedes W07s. A similar string of Grand Prix victories taken by Hamilton in Austria, Canada, Monaco and Germany shifted the balance back, and by the August break, Lewis had narrowed the deficit to 19 points. At this point, most around the sport were writing off Rosberg. Instead, he strung together spectacular victories at Spa, Monza, Marina Bay and Suzuka. That winning run was followed by Hamilton's engine failure and retirement from P1 in Malaysia, one of several races in which Lewis faced mechanical issues. Another sign that 2016 would be Nico's year. The last 4 Grand Prix of the season all ended up 1-2 for Mercedes, with Hamilton on top from Rosberg each time. Nico arrived at Abu Dhabi in late November, nursing a 12-point lead. He needed to at least make the podium if Hamilton won from pole position. Lewis never led by much, and in the closing laps intentionally slowed, after denying he would do so before the race, to allow other drivers to catch and pass Rosberg, despite repeated instructions from the team not to risk losing the race to Vettel, who used pit stop strategy to bring himself into P3 and was gaining quickly. The tactic failed, as Rosberg held off the other German to finish second by 0.439 seconds and win his World Championship. Rosberg called the race the most intense 55 laps of my life. A decade after debuting in F1 for Williams at the 2006 Bahrain Grand Prix, where he turned heads by setting the fastest lap, and 5 years after beating Schumacher when Braun GP became Mercedes-AMG. Nico Rosberg had proven he could race with the best. That was enough. Just 5 days later, he retired, announcing the startling decision on social media. Only the 5th Drivers' Champion not to defend his title, and the first to retire as world champion since Alain Prost in 1993. The emotional cost of a 10-month season requiring complete concentration against a teammate whom he called the benchmark of racing drivers was a price Rosberg did not want to continue paying. For 25 years in racing, it's been my dream, my one thing to become Formula 1 world champion, he explained. This season was so damn tough. I pushed like crazy in every area after the disappointments of the last 2 years. When asked if there was any chance of a return, Rosberg smiled and replied, "No, definitely not. End of story, done." Valtteri Bottas would step into the Mercedes left vacant by Nico Rosberg in 2017, but was no match for Lewis Hamilton, who would bounce back from the loss of the championship in 2016 by winning the next 4 in a row with relative comfort. Sebastian Vettel in a Ferrari provided a little resistance, but Hamilton's titles were rarely in doubt. But as Mercedes dominated the sport through the turbo hybrid era, they let complacency set in. As the rest of the grid innovated their aero designs to a higher rake, Mercedes remained with their winning formula. But in F1, to stand still is to fall back. And in 2021, Lewis Hamilton would pay the price for his team's conservative development.
Max Verstappen, for the first time ever, is champion of the world!
As the Formula 1 world geared up for the 2020 F1 season and another year of expected Mercedes dominance, a tragedy occurred as the world grappled with the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to the start of the season, Ferrari and AlphaTauri expressed concern about the spread of the virus and its effects on the championship. Both teams are based in Italy, which had suffered one of the worst outbreaks of the virus outside China at the time, and so both Ferrari and AlphaTauri were therefore concerned over the ability of their staff to leave a quarantine zone that was established in northern Italy. Ross Brawn, the managing director of the sport at the time, announced that Grand Prix would not go ahead if a team were blocked from entering a host nation, but that events could go ahead if a team voluntarily chose not to enter a host nation. In spite of everything going on around the world, the paddock arrived in Melbourne for the season opener on the 15th of March. With Mercedes expected to carry on where they'd left off, dominating the last 5 years, all the talk in the lead up to the opening race was of COVID-19 and what it could mean for the sport. In the early days of the pandemic, information about the virus was scant and misinformation was running wild. No one really knew what was going to happen, and there was no plan for Formula 1. Despite some of the teams and drivers voicing their outright disgust that the season was going ahead as planned, the sport had hundreds of millions of dollars riding on delivering the season that was scheduled. In Australia, hundreds of thousands of fans had spent their hard-earned money to get tickets for the season opener, and F1 had to provide. The season-opening Australian race was abruptly cancelled shortly before the start of the first free practice session, after it was revealed that a member of the paddock had contracted COVID. With no idea about the contagiousness of the virus or the risks associated with having it, the sport's owners Liberty Media had to take the difficult decision to cancel the race, with fans sitting in grandstands waiting for the start of free practice. Surprisingly, the rest of the season was not immediately cancelled. No one knew how long the pandemic would last, so instead, many races were simply postponed. As information and research revealed the features of the virus, the world began to understand that with some changes to how everything was handled, a lot of life could go back to normal. After horribly mismanaging the originally planned opening round of the season in Australia, Liberty Media and the FIA did extremely well to host 17 races between July and December. It's easy to imagine why the 2020 Formula 1 season would have stretched the teams more than ever before. At first, only 8 races were announced, presumably enough to label the season as a world championship based on the FIA's sporting regulations. As the first part of the season progressed, Formula 1 announced races on the go. At one point, the participants not knowing whether the championship would be decided over 12, 15 or more races. The other impact was on the drivers, most of them being forced to remain in their own bubbles and spend weeks away from home. Pierre Gasly's house was burgled, while Lewis Hamilton commented that this season took more away from him on the personal front than ever before. And of course, 3 drivers missed out on races due to being infected by the virus: Sergio Perez, Lance Stroll, and then Hamilton himself. The COVID-19 impact saw Formula 1 scrap the original calendar for 2020 and offer a far bolder revised version. A handful of circuits returned to host races: Portimao, Nürburgring, Turkey among others, while Mugello hosted its first ever Formula One Grand Prix. The addition of new and returning venues increased unpredictability of form, except for Mercedes, and offered something for fans to get excited about during a year of fear. The cancellation of the Monaco Grand Prix meant that 2020 would mark the first time since 1954 that the race had not been held. Before the teams fought for championship honours, they came together for Project Pitlane, Formula One's contribution toward the fight against COVID-19. The teams used their advanced understanding of technology to help with the manufacturing of respiratory devices. This included rapid design, prototype manufacturing, test and skilled assembly, things that Formula One excel at. From assisting only the automobile industry, Formula One teams were now assisting humanity at large. While it was an incredible effort from Formula One to get a 17-race calendar together for 2020, the extra measures required to do so and the cancelled races had an impact. Financially, COVID-19 almost crippled Formula One. What had been an overall profit of $17 million for F1 in 2019 turned into $386 million loss. This massive financial loss was felt throughout the sport. Team payments are influenced by the sport's revenues and dropped from $1,012 million in 2019 to $711 million in 2020. And that figure for 2020 included one-time fees that were related to the team signing up to the new Concord Agreement. The sport had planned to overhaul its technical regulations for the 2021 championship in one of the largest changes in its 70-year history. The pandemic prompted these changes to be postponed until 2022, with teams required to enter their 2020 cars in the 2021 championship to minimize the financial stress placed on the teams. The sport had also planned to introduce a $175 million budget cap in 2021, which was later revised to $150 million. Teams called for further revisions to $100 million, arguing that the pandemic threatened the future of 4 of the 10 teams. Despite the budget cap being introduced and financial support from the sport, some teams were not able to escape the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Having been in the sport and headed by the Williams family since 1977, the Williams team is one of the longest running and most successful teams in the sport's history, but with money running out, the Williams family were forced to sell the team to American investors, Doralton Capital. Under Frank Williams' guidance, the team had won 9 Constructors' Championships, 7 Drivers' Championships, and 114 races. Under his leadership, they'd seen some of the best drivers to ever grace the sport drive their cars. But after 43 years, on Friday 21st August 2020, the team left his care. With everything else changing due to the pandemic, one thing remained the same. Lewis Hamilton won the Drivers' Championship by well over 100 points. But behind him, a young Dutchman had been slowly catching. At Red Bull, the car design guru of modern F1 Adrian Newey had been slowly but surely innovating, looking for any edge he could find to upset the established order in Formula One and dethrone Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. Still, Max Verstappen finished the 2020 season 133 points behind Hamilton, and with the introduction of the budget cap and the FIA limiting the parts that teams could work on to try and save money, no one expected anything other than another season of Lewis Hamilton comfortably cruising to victory. Some rule changes were enacted by the FIA as well. The floor of the cars were clipped in order to reduce downforce for 2021. This change was expected to reduce downforce levels by 5%. Further, some slots on the edge of the floor were removed. Brake duct winglets were narrowed by 40mm and diffuser fences were narrowed by 50mm. These 3 changes reduced downforce levels by a further 5%, meaning the 2021 regulations saw a total 10% reduction in downforce. The dual-axis steering, or DAS system, developed by Mercedes in 2020 was banned starting from 2021. The DAS system allowed the driver to adjust the toe of the front wheels to optimize mechanical grip by pulling or pushing on the steering wheel. These changes made just enough of a difference that Mercedes had to innovate with their aerodynamics, something that they just weren't as good at as Red Bull. Still though, 133 points was a massive deficit to overhaul, but at the first race of the season, Red Bull gave the first indication that they might be able to manage it. After the preseason testing, it was the paddock consensus that it was Red Bull and not the winners of the last 7 titles, Mercedes, who had the better package. And that played out through much of the weekend, with Verstappen comfortably on pole and ahead in the race in the early stages. But a combination of Mercedes' strategy and superb Hamilton management out in front led to an epic conclusion, with Verstappen charging up behind the 7-time champion in that faster car. Hamilton held his nerve and, critically, Verstappen miscued his one overtaking opportunity late on, by running wide in passing the Mercedes. He had to cede position afterwards and wouldn't get close again. A thrilling wheel-to-wheel battle between F1's two stars, who'd rarely gone head-to-head before, represented the perfect start to the season and a sign of exactly what was to come. The two would trade wins through the opening 5 races of the season, but in Baku, the season's first big shock would happen. Everything was pointing towards a Verstappen victory as he led a Red Bull 1-2, with Hamilton not able to match Max or Perez in the race, with few laps remaining. But a dramatic and cruel tyre puncture caused by a problem with the Pirelli tyres at the race ended the title leader's race completely and gave Hamilton the perfect chance to claw back some points. Hamilton started second for the race restart and looked set to pass Perez into turn 1 when he inadvertently switched a brake switch on his Mercedes steering wheel and missed the corner completely. That dropped him out of the points, leaving Perez to win. It was a monumental mistake from Hamilton, but the real impact of the mistake wouldn't be felt until much later in the season. The error proved an even bigger setback for Hamilton as Verstappen would go on to win the following 3 races, and going into the Silverstone Grand Prix, Max was starting to pull ahead in the championship, leading Hamilton by 182 points to 150. While the two drivers had fought hard up until this point, it was in England that the title battle truly ignited. After Verstappen won the first ever sprint race at Silverstone, extending his lead to 33 points on the Saturday, Hamilton knew he could ill afford to drop further behind his rival in the main Grand Prix. A thrilling wheel-to-wheel duel ensued straight off the line over the race's opening half a lap, before the rivals came to Cobb's corner. With Hamilton trying to overtake down the inside, but Verstappen holding his line on the outside, the type of collision that many long thought inevitable had finally happened. While the Mercedes was able to continue, Verstappen flew off the circuit at high speed into the barriers at around 180 miles an hour and was later taken to hospital for precautionary checks. After the post-red flag race restart, Hamilton fought back from a 10-second time penalty to overtake Ferrari's Leclerc on lap 50 of 52, as he secured a record-extending 8th win in front of his home fans, suddenly reducing Verstappen's lead to just 8 points. Seeing Hamilton's wild celebrations while lying in his hospital bed, Verstappen was outraged by the lack of sportsmanship from his competitor, and from then on, the two were at knife points. A poor result in Hungary for Verstappen and a curtailed Belgian Grand Prix meant the situation going into the race at Monza was Verstappen led Hamilton by just 3 points after 13 rounds of racing. Starting from pole, Verstappen appeared well set to stretch his championship lead over Hamilton, but he lost the lead to the fast-starting Daniel Ricciardo. After both suffering slow pit stops, Hamilton and Verstappen's races ended in the gravel at the first chicane, after a frightening clash on lap 26, as the Red Bull attempted to overtake the Mercedes. Verstappen was this time found at fault and handed a 3-place grid drop for Russia. Hamilton was undoubtedly saved during the accident from serious injury by his car's halo. At the following race, Hamilton would register a historic 100th Formula 1 win. Going into the final 4 races of the season, Verstappen had managed to build a lead of 19 points and, on form, looked to have the stronger car. Hamilton's title hopes looked to be evaporating when he was disqualified from qualifying for a rear wing infringement, meaning he started the sprint race from the back of the grid instead of the head of the field. The Brit would go on to produce one of his best ever weekends of driving though. He somehow recovered to finish 5th, but a 5-place grid penalty for an engine change meant he'd start Sunday's event back in 10th. Hamilton wasn't going to let the 9 cars in front of him stop his title charge though. The rivals went head-to-head for much of the race, and Verstappen angered Hamilton with a questionable defense into turn 4 on lap 48. The Mercedes driver made the decisive overtake 11 laps later though, reducing Verstappen's lead to 14 points as the paddock headed to the Middle East for the final 3 races of the season. The Qatar Grand Prix was a case of damage limitation for Verstappen after he was given a 5-place grid penalty for a yellow flag infringement in qualifying. Hamilton converted his dominant pole into a runaway and crucial win to strengthen his hopes of winning a record 8th world title. Verstappen's lead was reduced to just 8 points with 2 races remaining. The penultimate race of the season proved to be one of F1's greatest ever. Hamilton and Verstappen collided again in one of numerous incidents between the pair at the inaugural Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Hamilton was in complete control when Mick Schumacher crashed into the barriers on lap 10, with the Brit pitting under the subsequent safety car. Schumacher's incident brought out the red flag though, and Verstappen, who led the restart having stayed on track, pushed Hamilton wide after his title rival got off the line quickest. However, Perez, Nikita Mazepin and George Russell all crashed out, bringing out another red flag. Pushed back to third for this restart, Verstappen leapfrogged Hamilton and Esteban Ocon as he reclaimed the lead, setting up an epic tussle between the two title protagonists. Hamilton was forced to take evasive action after being run wide on lap 37, and Verstappen was told to hand over first place, but as the Dutchman slowed, the Mercedes hit him up the back. Verstappen was later penalised for the incident. Hamilton eventually did get ahead, and with Verstappen second again, it meant both drivers entered the season decider in Abu Dhabi level on 369.5 points. The build-up to the season finale had been dominated by talk that such a relentlessly competitive championship might be decided by a moment of controversy. It ultimately was, but not in the manner expected. With the title contenders tied on points for a final race showdown for the first time since 1974, Verstappen took a brilliant pole, yet it was Hamilton who was ahead by the race's first turn. And one moment of wheel-to-wheel drama later, around the opening lap aside, the Mercedes driver appeared to be firmly on course for the win that would see him become F1's first 8-time champion. But then came the lap 53 safety car for Nicholas Latifi's crash and the final lap shootout for the title. With Mercedes livid about the manner in which the end of the safety car period had ended, with only the lapped cars between Hamilton and Verstappen allowed to unlap themselves, and the race then restarted at the end of that very same tour. The Red Bull on fresh tyres overtook Hamilton into turn 5, and it was Verstappen, aged 24, who was world champion for the first time. With that race win, Verstappen ended Mercedes' complete domination of 8 years of relatively stable regulations. The fallout of that late safety car period would be monumental. The Netflix series Drive to Survive had catapulted the sport into the public eye. Viewing figures were at an all-time high, and especially on social media, Formula 1 was booming. The decision to let through only the lapped cars between Hamilton and Verstappen so the season could end under racing conditions was not received well. Latifi, Verstappen, the race director Michael Massey, and many other members of the Red Bull team and the FIA would receive death threats over social media as Hamilton fans were incensed by what happened. Mercedes lodged 2 separate protests against the race's result. Both protests were dismissed, and Mercedes announced their intention to appeal the dismissal of the protest regarding the handling of the restart following the safety car period. A statement from the FIA acknowledged the controversy and that it was tarnishing the image of the championship and the due celebration. The statement was made after a meeting of the FIA World Motorsport Council, which was scheduled for the 15th of December 2021, and was described as extending an olive branch to Mercedes. On the 16th of December 2021, Mercedes announced that it had withdrawn its challenge to the race result. In addition, Hamilton boycotted the end-of-season FIA prize-giving ceremony, held on the 16th of December, and at the time there were questions about whether he would continue in F1. Following an FIA investigation and inquiry, Michael Massey was removed from his role as race director, being replaced by Niels Wittich and Eduardo Freitas, with Herbie Blasch appointed as a permanent senior advisor alongside Wittich and Freitas. On the 10th of March 2022, the FIA World Motorsport Council report on the events of the final race of the season was announced, and that the race director called the safety car back into the pit lane without it having completed an additional lap, as required by the Formula 1 sporting regulations. However, also noted that the results of the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and the FIA Formula 1 World Championship are valid, final, and cannot now be changed. The controversy didn't end there though. In October 2022, the FIA published their review of the team's budgets for 2021. Red Bull had committed a minor financial breach of the budget cap of over $2 million. Additionally, Red Bull were found to have made procedural breaches. Red Bull were punished with a $7 million fine and a 10% reduction in wind tunnel testing time for a period of 1 year. Opinion on the outcome amongst F1 team personnel was divided, with Red Bull team principal Christian Horner begrudgingly accepting what he deemed to be a draconian punishment, stating that the loss of wind tunnel time could cost them between 0.25 and 0.5 seconds a lap in performance. 2022 would see the beginning of a new era in Formula 1, the return of ground effect floors. Formula 1's budget cap was now in full effect, and teams were more limited than ever before on how much testing they could do, both on track and in their wind tunnels and with computational models. The key changes to the cars were all aimed at making the racing closer. Over the previous 8 years, the cars had started to create so much dirty air behind them that it was almost impossible to stay close to a car ahead of you. The 2022 car had two long underfloor tunnels which created a ground effect, meaning there is more suction under the car to pull it to the tarmac, while also ensuring more of the downforce is generated from under the car. The concept was popular back in the 1970s and 80s in F1. Combined with changes to the rear wing, beam wing and diffuser, a lot of the air that came off the cars went straight up, leaving relatively calm air behind. The pre-season expectation was that Mercedes would bounce back from their loss in 2021 and return to the top of the sport. After all, they've been there for the last 8 years, so why would anyone expect anything else to happen? There were 2 pre-season tests that year to help the teams get dialed in with the completely overhauled aero regulations, and at the first test, Mercedes appeared to have a relatively competitive car, which looked a lot like the rest of the grid. It quickly became apparent though that this was not the car they intended to run for the season. They had a secret, revolutionary spec of car that they were hiding for the second test. Their theory was that if they showed the rest of the grid their actual car too early, the other teams would have plenty of time to copy them, and any advantage they got from their ingenious idea would be quickly wiped out. They turned up to the second practice with a car that had incredibly slim side pods, which were quickly described as zero pods by the F1 media. While they looked revolutionary, they were not a revolution on track. The Mercedes car had massive problems, and by not running it in the first test, they'd essentially given themselves half the testing time of the rest of the grid. An error that proved fatal for the next 2 seasons. Red Bull, on the other hand, had the new regulations dialed in. Their RB18 started the season strongly and only got stronger from there. Ferrari looked competitive to start with, but strategic blunders and a complete lack of effective development meant that Max Verstappen strolled to victory, eventually winning by 146 points. In 2023, Red Bull would carry on where they left off, utterly dominating the sport while their traditional rivals Mercedes and Ferrari floundered. The team would win 21 of the 22 Grand Prix, matching the 1988 McLaren record of winning all but 1 race in a season. While their winning time margin in individual races was not as big as Mercedes had been at the start of the turbo-hybrid era, the calm and confident manner that Verstappen dominated the sport in was utterly unbeatable. The Dutchman won 19 of the 22 races, breaking every single season record in Formula 1 history, and putting in a year-long performance that may never be matched. After 73 years of incredible racing, Formula 1 is continuing to innovate to stay relevant with the modern automotive market. It's leading the way in development of sustainable fuels, made in a lab rather than over millions of years underground. As the globe struggles with the effects of climate change, the auto industry is desperately in search for ways to reduce its impact. By 2030, it's anticipated there'll be close to 2 billion cars on the road, with only 8% of those pure battery electric vehicles. That means that other solutions are needed to slash carbon emissions. As part of F1's plans to be net zero carbon by 2030, the sport is pioneering a drop-in 100% sustainable fuel that can not only be used in F1 cars from 2026, but crucially can be utilized by most road cars around the world. The fuel that F1 will run on from 2026 will be unique and lab-created. E-fuels offer such a wonderful opportunity, says Ross Brawn, who was F1's managing director of motorsports till he retired at the end of 2022. We're working on an e-fuel where the carbon circle is completely neutral, so the carbon utilized to produce that fuel is the same quantity as the carbon emitted from the internal combustion engine. It means that the engines do not add anything to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. For over 70 years, F1 has been at the cutting edge of innovation, developing the most efficient power unit and hybrid systems ever created. Now, the sport is focused on helping drive a green revolution for the entire planet. F1 has always pushed technology amazingly well and pioneered genuine technology that can be used in passenger vehicles and road cars and so on, says Brawn. We have an amazingly efficient internal combustion engine. This concept that when you set the competition, if you set it with the right objectives, if the objective is the best sustainable fuel, then manufacturers will pour millions into development to try and achieve that, and then we get all the benefits for the wider society. Formula 1 knows that competition can be an incredible driver of innovation. The sport knows the impact it can have on the world around it and is harnessing that power to try and make a difference globally. Over the best part of a century, Formula 1 has stood at the forefront of automotive innovation. It plays host to the greatest minds in mechanical and aerodynamic engineering and has become a battleground of money and the mind. On track, the world's greatest drivers strive for fractions of a percentage of increased performance, putting their lives on the line every time they step into a car. Formula One has always provided a thrill unlike anything else in the world, and with a more financially and ecologically sustainable future ahead of it, it will stay at the forefront of motor racing and auto innovation for decades to come. F1 thrills us, it excites us, it makes us shout, it makes us cry, and each season it glues us to our televisions for 20+ weekends a year, cheering on our favourite drivers and our favourite teams, letting us revel in its jaw-dropping action and never-ending intrigue. Formula One has been incredible and unmissable for the last 73 years, and it will always continue to be so.